It began not with gas chambers or camps, but with words whispered, laws passed, and neighbors turning against neighbors. What started as words, laws, and propaganda gradually transformed into ghettos sealed with barbed wire, trains packed tighter than cattle cars, and camps where the boundaries between life and death were measured in minutes. The Holocaust was not a single moment, nor confined to a single place. It was a system, vast and organized, stretching from Poland to France, from the Baltic states to the Balkans, leaving no corner of Europe untouched. It was a story of bureaucrats turning genocide into paperwork, soldiers transforming obedience into cruelty, and neighbors who looked away while others disappeared forever. Yet within that story were also voices of courage, men, women, and children who resisted in whispers, in uprisings, in the very act of survival. As the world looked on, some indifferent, some complicit, and some unaware, more than 6 million Jews, along with Roma, political prisoners, the disabled, and countless others deemed unworthy, were systematically annihilated. Camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became symbols not of war, but of industrialized death. Diaries smuggled from attics, scraps of paper buried under ash, and trembling testimonies from survivors remain as fragments of humanity preserved against deliberate erasure. And when the war ended, liberation brought not joy, but an unfathomable confrontation with mass graves, skeletal survivors, and the echo of silence where entire communities had once thrived. This is not only the story of destruction, but of memory, of how the Holocaust became the defining warning of the modern world. A reminder that cruelty and indifference, when left unchecked, can dismantle civilization itself. Tonight we will journey across those years of darkness, from the rise of Nazi ideology to the ghettos and camps, from the mechanics of extermination to the resilience of those who endured. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let the history unfold, not as numbers or dates, but as lives once lived, voices once heard, and truths that must never be forgotten. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because across time zones, across generations, we carry this memory together, so that history's most haunting chapter is never allowed to fade. Long before the rise of the Nazis, the soil of Europe had been seeded with suspicion, myth, and hostility toward the Jewish people. In medieval times, Jews were often cast as outsiders, marked by religion, language, and customs that set them apart from the majority population. When plagues struck, when crops failed, or when wars left towns in ruins, it was the Jewish communities who were singled out as scapegoats. Popular myths, such as the blood libel, accusing Jews of using Christian children in rituals, or tales of well poisoning during the Black Death, spread like wildfire through villages and cities alike. These falsehoods, amplified by sermons from pulpits and whispered rumors in marketplaces, became ingrained in cultural memory. In many regions, Jews were confined to ghettos, taxed heavily, and excluded from guilds, which forced them into roles such as moneylending, professions that carried their own stigma. The image of the Jew as both essential and despised took root, creating an enduring contradiction in European life. Periodic pogroms, from the Rhineland massacres of the Crusades to expulsions from England, France, and Spain, reminded Jews that their place in society was precarious. They were tolerated when convenient, persecuted when convenient, but never truly embraced as equals. This centuries-old cycle of exclusion and violence laid the deep cultural foundations upon which modern antisemitism would be built. By the Renaissance and early modern period, antisemitism had shifted but not vanished, adapting itself to new political and religious climates. Martin Luther, though initially sympathetic, published vicious tracts against Jews in the 16th century, calling for the burning of synagogues and the expulsion of Jewish communities from German lands. His words, written in the language of theological authority, carried enormous influence and would later be cited approvingly by Nazi propagandists. At the same time, the rise of centralized states in Europe brought waves of expulsions and restrictions, with Jews continually on the move, seeking safer territories but rarely finding permanent refuge. In Catholic lands, the Inquisition targeted conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, under pressure but were suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish practices. This further entrenched the myth of Jews as deceptive, untrustworthy, and eternally alien. Economic envy played its role as well. Christian elites accused Jews of greed, while conveniently relying on Jewish financiers to fund wars and build empires. Thus, antisemitism adapted, shifting between religious, social, and economic expressions, always finding new ways to marginalize and vilify. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, Jews were both indispensable and unwelcome, a paradox that carried forward into modern Europe. The prejudice endured, waiting for the moment when it could be weaponized on an unprecedented scale. The Enlightenment promised equality, reason, and universal rights. But even here, Jews remained on uncertain ground. In France, the Revolution granted Jews citizenship, a landmark step forward that inspired hope across Europe. Yet emancipation was uneven in places like Russia and much of Eastern Europe. Jews were still confined to the Pale of Settlement, forbidden to live freely outside designated areas. Pogroms erupted in Tsarist lands, brutal and indiscriminate, destroying entire communities while authorities turned a blind eye. In Western Europe, even where legal emancipation occurred, social prejudice persisted in subtler but equally damaging ways. Universities imposed quotas, certain professions quietly excluded Jews, and stereotypes flourished in newspapers and novels. The Dreyfus affair in France at the end of the 19th century revealed just how fragile Jewish integration truly was, as a Jewish army officer was falsely accused of treason, sparking a national crisis of anti-Semitism. The Enlightenment's failure to fully integrate Jews demonstrated that prejudice was not an archaic relic, but a living, adaptable force. While the language of hatred shifted from theology to pseudoscience, the target remained the same. It was within this contradictory world of legal progress and cultural rejection that modern anti-Semitism would grow its most dangerous roots. By the 19th century, a new form of anti-Semitism emerged, one clothed in the garb of science, progress, and nationalism. As European nations defined themselves along ethnic lines, Jews were increasingly labeled as perpetual outsiders, incapable of assimilation no matter their language, dress, or patriotism. The rise of so-called racial science brought claims that Jews were biologically inferior, their features catalogued in grotesque detail by anthropologists seeking to prove immutable differences. Writers and politicians exploited these theories, arguing that Jewish influence was corrupting national culture and diluting ethnic purity. Newspapers in Vienna, Berlin, and Paris published caricatures portraying Jews as greedy, scheming, and parasitic. At the same time, economic crises made Jews easy targets, accused of both controlling international finance and undermining honest labor. Political movements sprang up that openly campaigned against Jews, weaving anti-Semitism into the broader fabric of nationalist ideologies. In Germany and Austria especially, parties that blended populism with racial hatred gained traction, normalizing anti-Semitism as a political tool. This shift was profound. Hatred was no longer a matter of religious difference or social prejudice. It was recast as destiny, written into blood and biology. And with this shift, antisemitism became not merely discrimination, but an existential threat to Jewish survival. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw anti-Semitism woven into international conspiracy theories that would later echo in Nazi propaganda. Publications like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forged document claiming to reveal a Jewish plot for world domination, spread widely across Europe and beyond. Though repeatedly exposed as a fabrication, the text was eagerly embraced by anti-Semites as proof of their darkest suspicions. It depicted Jews as masterminds of revolution and capitalism simultaneously, orchestrators of both chaos and control, a contradiction that made the myth adaptable to any circumstance. In Russia, the book justified pogroms in Germany. It would later be cited as evidence of Jewish treachery. Industrialization and rapid social change only fueled fears that Jewish influence was destabilizing traditional society. From labor strikes to socialist movements, Jews were accused of being behind every disruption, no matter how conflicting the charges. The rise of mass politics and cheap print media allowed these myths to spread to millions, embedding themselves in the popular imagination. By the time Hitler entered politics, the ground was already fertile for a message that painted Jews not as individuals, but as a monolithic, dangerous enemy. The mythology of a hidden Jewish hand pulling the strings of nations had already been carefully cultivated for decades. In Central and Eastern Europe, anti-Semitism was not just an ideology, it was a lived, daily reality. Jewish communities faced legal restrictions on where they could live, what they could own, and how they could work. Pogroms devastated towns, leaving survivors traumatized and scattered, with little protection from local authorities. In some places, entire villages were burned, synagogues destroyed, and families massacred, all under the gaze of indifferent officials. For Jews who fled westward, migration brought its own challenges: poverty, language barriers, and the persistence of anti-Semitism even in supposedly enlightened societies. Urban ghettos formed in places like Warsaw and Nuremberg, centers of vibrant culture, but also constant vulnerability. Political parties in Poland, Romania, and Hungary openly campaigned on anti-Semitic platforms, blaming Jews for economic woes. Universities introduced numerous clausus laws, restricting the number of Jewish students, ensuring exclusion from the educated elite. These experiences hardened both Jewish identity and the prejudice directed against it, creating a volatile tension. As Europe marched toward the First World War, anti-Semitism had become both pervasive and politically useful, woven into the national fabric of many countries. The war would not erase these hatreds, it would intensify them. The First World War and its aftermath created conditions that magnified anti-Semitic sentiment to unprecedented levels. Jews fought bravely in armies on all sides, but their loyalty was questioned regardless of their service. In Germany, the defeat of 1918 spawned the stab-in-the-back myth, a poisonous conspiracy claiming that Jews and socialists had betrayed the nation from within. The Treaty of Versailles deepened resentment, and many Germans searched for scapegoats to explain their nation's humiliation and economic collapse. Right-wing movements quickly found their answer in Jewish communities, accused of both Bolshevism and capitalism, blamed simultaneously for radical revolution and exploitative finance. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s, with savings wiped out and livelihoods destroyed, further fueled these accusations. Anti-Semitic newspapers and pamphlets depicted Jews as profiteers thriving on German suffering. Even moderate politicians adopted coded language, warning against foreign influences undermining national strength. The fragile Weimar Republic struggled to control this tide of resentment, while extremist groups thrived by channeling it into rage and violence. It was in this crucible of defeat, despair, and economic chaos that Adolf Hitler found an audience for his message. By the 1920s, the cultural, religious, and political strands of anti-Semitism had converged into a toxic ideology, ready to be weaponized by extremists. Centuries of myths, from medieval accusations of blood rituals to modern conspiracies of world domination, merged into a single narrative of Jewish danger. The shift from religious prejudice to racial anti-Semitism meant that conversion, assimilation, or patriotism could no longer protect Jews from hatred. They were marked as an eternal enemy, their existence framed as incompatible with the survival of the nation. For millions of ordinary Europeans, these prejudices were not abstract theories, but deeply ingrained beliefs, passed down through generations. Schools, churches, newspapers, and political speeches reinforced them daily, creating a social environment where anti-Semitism was normalized. When Hitler rose to prominence, promising to restore Germany's pride by purging it of its enemies, he was drawing upon this long and poisoned well. The Holocaust did not emerge in a vacuum. It grew out of a history of suspicion, exclusion, and violence that had been centuries in the making. The roots of hatred ran deep, stretching back through the ages, preparing the ground for the devastation to come. And in 1933, when the Nazis seized power, those roots would bear their most destructive fruit in human history. The end of the First World War left Germany in a state of shock, humiliation, and bitter confusion. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 imposed crushing reparations, territorial losses, and severe military restrictions on the German state. Many Germans felt betrayed, convinced that their army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but stabbed in the back by politicians, revolutionaries, and Jews at home. This so-called Dolchstoßlegende, or stab-in-the-back myth, became a rallying cry for nationalists and extremists. The once proud Kaiserreich had collapsed, replaced by the fragile and chaotic Weimar Republic. Streets were filled with angry veterans, disillusioned workers, and citizens who could not comprehend the depth of their nation's fall from power. In beer halls and street corners, resentment festered, growing into radical ideologies that demanded revenge and restoration. Inflation skyrocketed, food shortages spread, and the Republic's democratic leaders appeared incapable of addressing the crisis. The very idea of liberal democracy seemed alien to a society accustomed to imperial authority and national pride. Out of this toxic climate emerged groups that preached hatred, scapegoating, and the promise of rebirth through strength. The Treaty of Versailles was more than a diplomatic document. It became a national trauma embedded in Germany's collective psyche. Germans saw their army capped at 100,000 men, their navy stripped of battleships, and their air force abolished entirely. The Saarland was placed under League of Nations control, while Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, and vast territories in the east were ceded to Poland. Millions of ethnic Germans suddenly found themselves outside the borders of the Reich, fueling bitterness and a desire for revision. Reparations demanded billions of marks, a sum that seemed impossible for a shattered economy to pay. Every payment reminded Germans of their subjugation, each installment a humiliation reinforced by Allied pressure. Nationalists labeled the politicians who signed the treaty as the November criminals, traitors who had sold out the fatherland. This sense of betrayal created fertile ground for anyone who could promise to restore dignity and power. From the beginning, the seeds of future radicalism were tied directly to the treaty's perceived injustices. For a defeated nation searching for identity, the call for revenge became irresistible. Economic turmoil in the 1920s deepened Germany's despair and eroded faith in the Weimar government. The early 1920s saw hyperinflation spiral out of control, with the German mark losing value so rapidly that workers carried wages home in wheelbarrows. Savings evaporated overnight, pensions became worthless, and middle-class families sank into poverty despite years of hard work. Photographs captured children playing with stacks of worthless banknotes, symbolic of the absurdity of the crisis. International loans, particularly from the United States under the Dawes Plan, temporarily stabilized the economy, but the recovery was fragile and dependent on external forces. The Wall Street crash of 1929 brought this fragile stability crashing down, plunging Germany once again into mass unemployment and despair. By 1932, more than 6 million Germans were out of work, while factories stood idle and hunger spread across cities and villages. Political polarization intensified, with the communists on one side and radical nationalists on the other, both promising solutions that democracy could not deliver. Weimar politicians, locked in endless parliamentary squabbles, appeared helpless in the face of mounting crises. For millions, only a strong leader who could sweep away weakness and restore order seemed capable of saving Germany. It was in this turbulent environment that Adolf Hitler emerged from obscurity and began his ascent to power. A failed artist from Austria, a decorated veteran of the First World War, and a man who had experienced both the trenches and the post-war chaos firsthand, Hitler embodied the resentments of his time. He joined the German Workers' Party in 1919, quickly rising to prominence with his fiery speeches filled with nationalist rhetoric, anti-Semitic myths, and promises of revival. By 1920, the party had rebranded itself as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party, under Hitler's growing influence. He proved to be a masterful orator, captivating audiences with speeches that transformed their despair into rage and their rage into hope. Hitler spoke of betrayal, of conspiracies, of a Jewish threat undermining Germany from within. He painted a vision of a pure, strong, unified nation, cleansed of weakness and restored to greatness. In the beer halls of Munich, his words electrified listeners, convincing them that destiny had chosen him as the man to lead Germany out of humiliation. In an age desperate for certainty, Hitler offered absolute answers, and in the disarray of Weimar politics, his voice became impossible to ignore. The Nazi Party's first attempt at seizing power came in November 1923, with the infamous Beer Hall Putsch in Munich. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler and his allies believed they could ignite a nationalist uprising and overthrow the Bavarian government as the first step toward seizing control of Germany. Armed supporters stormed a beer hall where Bavarian officials were meeting, declaring a national revolution. But the coup was poorly organized, lacked sufficient military backing, and collapsed within hours when police forces opened fire. 16 Nazis were killed, and Hitler himself was arrested and charged with treason. At first, it seemed like a crushing failure that would end his political career. Yet Hitler transformed his trial into a stage, delivering speeches that gained him national attention and sympathy. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served only 9 months, during which he dictated Mein Kampf, laying out his ideology of racial purity, antisemitism, and expansionism. The failed putsch, rather than destroying Hitler, elevated him to the status of a national figure. He learned that seizing power by force was too risky. Power would have to be won through politics, manipulation, and propaganda. The Nazi Party rebuilt itself after the putsch, this time focusing on electoral politics, organization, and propaganda. They developed a powerful propaganda machine, with Joseph Goebbels emerging as a master manipulator of mass media. The swastika flag, the uniformed brown shirts, and the theatrical rallies gave the movement a sense of unity, strength, and inevitability. The party's newspaper, Der Völkische Beobachter, spread Nazi ideology across the country, blending conspiracy theories with calls for national renewal. The SA, or Sturmabteilung, acted as the party's paramilitary wing, intimidating opponents and clashing with communists in the streets. Hitler positioned himself as both an ordinary soldier and a visionary leader, someone who could channel the frustrations of the common man into a collective crusade. Economic collapse during the Great Depression gave the Nazis the perfect opportunity, as desperate citizens turned to anyone who promised jobs, stability, and dignity. Nazi rhetoric linked Germany's misery to the Treaty of Versailles, Jewish influence, and weak democratic politicians. By exploiting fear, prejudice, and nationalism, the party transformed from a fringe movement into a political powerhouse. What had once been dismissed as radical extremism now seemed like a legitimate alternative to a failing republic. By the early 1930s, the Nazis were no longer a fringe party. They were a national force reshaping German politics. In the 1930 elections, they gained 107 seats in the Reichstag, becoming the second largest party in Germany. 2 years later, in July 1932, they reached their peak with 230 seats, emerging as the largest party in parliament. Yet despite their popularity, they struggled to secure stable coalitions, as other parties feared Hitler's extremism. President Paul von Hindenburg, an aging war hero, resisted appointing Hitler as chancellor, viewing him as dangerous and unfit for leadership. But political paralysis deepened, and behind the scenes, conservative elites believed they could control Hitler by bringing him into government. Industrialists, aristocrats, and right-wing politicians saw him as a tool to crush communism and restore order. On January 30th, 1933, their gamble became reality. Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. What had once seemed unthinkable, an Austrian outsider leading the Reich, had now become fact. The Weimar Republic's weaknesses had opened the door for dictatorship, and the Nazis were poised to transform Germany forever. The rise of the Nazis was not inevitable, but it was made possible by the perfect storm of defeat, humiliation, and despair. Versailles had broken Germany's pride, hyperinflation had destroyed its economy, and political division had paralyzed its democracy. Hitler's genius lay not in originality, but in his ability to weave together existing prejudices, resentments, and myths into a single, intoxicating vision. He told Germans that they were victims of betrayal, destined for greatness, and capable of renewal, if only they purged themselves of weakness. He framed Jews, communists, and international conspirators as the enemies of the nation, transforming prejudice into a call for action. His speeches promised clarity in a world of chaos, strength in an age of weakness, and pride in a nation humiliated. When he stood before cheering crowds, he embodied the hope of millions desperate for salvation. By 1933, Germany had placed its fate in his hands, believing that he alone could lead them to rebirth. But beneath the banners, the slogans, and the promises, a nightmare was already beginning to unfold. The rise of the Nazis was not merely the ascent of a party, it was the opening act of catastrophe. At the core of Nazism lay a radical and dangerous belief, the conviction that humanity was divided into distinct races, each locked in a perpetual struggle for survival. The Nazis embraced the myth of a master race, the Aryans, whom they claimed were destined to rule the world. This idea drew heavily from distorted interpretations of social Darwinism, where the natural selection of species was twisted into justification for human hierarchy. Hitler and his followers insisted that the Aryan race, particularly those of Nordic heritage with fair skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, embodied the pinnacle of human achievement. In contrast, Jews, Roma, Slavs, and other groups were categorized as inferior, parasitic, or even subhuman. The pseudo-scientific language of eugenics gave these prejudices an air of legitimacy, dressing hate in the clothing of biology and science. By labeling racial difference as biological destiny, the Nazis argued that inequality was not a product of culture or history, but of blood itself. This doctrine transformed prejudice into policy, convincing ordinary Germans that discrimination was natural, justified, and even necessary for survival. In this worldview, compassion became weakness, and domination became virtue. A society once governed by laws of politics and morality was now redefined by the imagined laws of racial struggle. The pseudoscience of eugenics became the intellectual backbone of Nazi racial thinking. Originating in the late 19th century and embraced across Europe and America, eugenics promoted the idea of improving humanity by encouraging the reproduction of the fit and limiting that of the unfit. In Germany, this took on a sinister racial dimension, where fitness was equated with Aryan blood and unfitness with Jewish or non-Aryan ancestry. Universities taught racial hygiene as legitimate science, with professors publishing charts, measurements, and studies that proved racial hierarchy. Skull shapes, nose lengths, and skin tones were catalogued in anthropological manuals as if they carried the secrets of human destiny. The Nazis institutionalized this thinking, passing sterilization laws in 1933 that targeted the disabled, the mentally ill, and anyone deemed hereditary defective. Doctors and bureaucrats became complicit in determining who was worthy of life and who should be prevented from reproducing. What began as medical prevention laid the groundwork for future annihilation, where categories of inferiority justified persecution and death. Eugenics gave Nazism the illusion of scientific rigor, allowing racial hatred to masquerade as objective truth. It was not merely an ideology of hate, but a program disguised as progress. Propaganda became the most powerful weapon in spreading and enforcing these racial ideas. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, orchestrated a vast campaign to saturate German society with Nazi racial doctrine. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, posters, and children's textbooks carried the message that Aryans were superior and Jews were enemies of the nation. Schoolchildren were taught racial science in classrooms, learning to identify typical Jewish features and distinguish Aryans from others. Movies like The Eternal Jew depicted Jews as vermin, parasites, and spreaders of disease, embedding hatred in visual imagery that bypassed rational thought. Posters showed noble Aryan families contrasted with grotesque caricatures of Jews, reducing human beings to symbols of corruption. Everyday language was poisoned, with derogatory terms normalized and repeated until they became unquestioned truths. By controlling the media, the Nazis made sure no German could escape the message, no matter how remote their village or how private their life. Propaganda did more than persuade. It created a reality where racial ideology became the lens through which all of society was viewed. Once accepted, this worldview could justify any action, no matter how cruel. Central to Nazi ideology was the obsession with purity, not just cultural purity, but biological purity of blood. The Nazis proclaimed that Aryan blood carried unique qualities that made Germans superior in creativity, strength, and morality. Any dilution of this bloodline through marriage with Jews or other so-called inferior races was framed as contamination. Laws were passed to enforce these beliefs, most notably the Nuremberg Laws of 1935. These laws prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Germans, stripped Jews of citizenship, and reduced them to subjects without political rights. Bureaucrats carefully documented family trees, with individuals forced to prove racial purity through grandparents' birth records. Families were torn apart as neighbors and acquaintances scrutinized one another for signs of impurity. The state intruded into the most intimate aspects of personal life, dictating whom one could love, marry, or even associate with. In this climate, social ostracism and legal persecution worked hand in hand, making racial doctrine a lived reality for millions. What had once been prejudice became law, turning ideology into the fabric of daily life. The Nazis extended their obsession with racial purity beyond the Jewish population to include other groups they labeled undesirable. The Roma, often derogatorily called gypsies, were cast as racial outsiders incapable of assimilation. Black Germans, many descended from colonial populations or the offspring of French occupation troops after World War I, were likewise deemed threats to the Aryan bloodline. The disabled and mentally ill were considered life unworthy of life, targeted in the infamous T4 euthanasia program. This program, disguised as mercy killing, authorized doctors to systematically murder tens of thousands in psychiatric hospitals using gas chambers, lethal injections, and starvation. What began as secretive medical cleansing became a rehearsal for the mass killings later carried out in the Holocaust. The Nazis also despised homosexuals, viewing them as degenerates who weakened the reproductive strength of the German people. Each of these groups was targeted not merely out of prejudice, but as part of a comprehensive program to engineer society through exclusion, sterilization, and extermination. The goal was nothing less than the creation of a racially homogeneous empire, cleansed of all defects. Hitler's personal beliefs shaped the extremes of Nazi racial doctrine, but he did not invent them alone. His writings in Mein Kampf articulated a worldview where history was seen as a brutal contest between races, with the Jews cast as eternal enemies. He described Jews not simply as a religion, but as a race, biologically distinct and inherently corrupt. To Hitler, Jews were conspirators responsible for capitalism, communism, cultural decay, and Germany's defeat in World War I. This sweeping conspiracy unified the fears of a fractured society into a single target. The idea that a tiny minority could secretly control nations and manipulate world events became a cornerstone of Nazi ideology. By personalizing Germany's struggles as the result of Jewish influence, Hitler provided an enemy that was both omnipresent and invisible. This turned antisemitism from a prejudice into a mission, a crusade to cleanse Germany and eventually the world of its supposed greatest threat. Once this belief was accepted, it framed every political, economic, and social problem as a racial struggle. For Hitler, the war against the Jews was not secondary, it was the defining purpose of his movement. Nazi racial ideology was also profoundly expansionist, tied to the dream of Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler argued that the German people needed more land to thrive, and this land would be taken from Eastern Europe. Slavic peoples, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, were considered racially inferior, destined for enslavement or annihilation. The conquest of the East would not only provide farmland and resources, but also clear the way for Aryan settlement. In this vision, the German peasant would become the new master of fertile lands, while native populations would be reduced to laborers or eliminated altogether. This ideology turned conquest into a biological imperative, a racial mission to secure the survival of the master race. War was not framed as political strategy, but as natural law, the inevitable expression of racial struggle. By fusing expansionism with racial doctrine, Hitler gave Germans a sense of destiny that went beyond borders and politics. The dream of a racially pure empire stretched across Europe, justifying aggression, conquest, and eventual genocide. In the Nazi worldview, Domination of other peoples was not cruelty, it was nature fulfilling its course. By the time the Nazis consolidated power in the 1930s, racial ideology had saturated every aspect of German life. Schools indoctrinated children with lessons about Aryan superiority and Jewish inferiority. Universities conducted racial research that lent academic weight to policies of exclusion. Popular culture reinforced stereotypes in films, art, and music, ensuring that entertainment itself became a vehicle for ideology. Bureaucrats enforced laws that determined who belonged and who did not, transforming prejudice into statecraft. The medical profession, once committed to healing, became an instrument of sterilization and killing. The church was pressured to align itself with Nazi racial policies, with pastors either conforming or facing persecution. Ordinary Germans, some enthusiastically and others reluctantly, became participants in a system that measured human worth by bloodline. The power of this ideology lay not only in its cruelty, but in its normalization. Hatred was no longer an aberration, but the foundation of society. By fusing pseudoscience, law, propaganda, and culture, the Nazis created a racial state that prepared its people for unimaginable crimes. This ideology was not merely theory, it was the blueprint for genocide. By 1935, 2 years after Hitler's rise to power, the Nazi regime began to codify its racial ideology into binding law. What had once been venomous rhetoric shouted in rallies or printed in propaganda now became the official legal framework of the German state. At the annual Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, under a sea of swastika banners and floodlit spectacle, Hitler announced the so-called Nuremberg Laws. These laws would redefine the very meaning of citizenship and identity in Germany, transforming Jews from citizens into outsiders. They established who was considered German, who was considered a Jew, and who belonged in the grey categories of mixed blood. Lawyers and racial theorists had worked for months to draft definitions based not on religion or culture, but ancestry, charting human worth through bloodlines. With cold bureaucratic precision, family trees were dissected, and grandparents' birth records became instruments of exclusion. Overnight, German Jews who had lived in the country for centuries found themselves legally segregated from their neighbors. The fanfare at Nuremberg was not merely a political event, but the birth of a new legal order rooted in racial hatred. It marked the moment when prejudice became state policy and dignity was stripped with the stroke of a pen. The first of the Nuremberg Laws, the Reich Citizenship Law, struck at the very heart of belonging. Citizenship, once a basic right, was now reserved only for those of German or kindred blood. Jews were reduced to the status of subjects, inhabitants of the Reich without political voice or protection. They could no longer vote, hold public office, or serve in the armed forces, cutting them off from the civic life of the nation. The second law, the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, intruded deeply into private life. It forbade marriages and sexual relations between Jews and Germans, criminalizing love itself if it crossed the boundaries of blood. Violators of these laws faced public humiliation, imprisonment, and ruin, as entire communities were encouraged to inform on one another. Weddings were cancelled, families torn apart, and relationships shattered under the gaze of the state. The very language of the law framed Jews as pollutants of Aryan purity, unworthy of intimacy or equality. What had once been personal choices of love, family, and civic duty were now weaponized as tools of exclusion. The Nuremberg Laws did not emerge in isolation, but as part of a broader web of discriminatory decrees. Over the months and years that followed, Jews were systematically excluded from professions, education, and social life. Jewish doctors were forbidden to treat non-Jewish patients, branding them as untrustworthy even in the act of healing. Lawyers, teachers, civil servants, and journalists were purged from their positions, replaced by Aryans deemed politically reliable. Universities set quotas to limit Jewish students, while professional associations expelled Jewish members. Even artists and musicians were struck from public life, their works banned, their voices silenced. Every sector of society became a site of exclusion, turning daily routines into constant reminders of separation. This gradual erosion made Jewish life increasingly precarious, as livelihoods vanished and futures narrowed. The laws made no distinction between the successful doctor, the humble shopkeeper, or the young student. All were defined not by who they were, but by who their ancestors had been. Through this legal machinery, the Nazis stripped Jews not only of their rights, but also of their ability to participate in the very society they had helped build. To enforce these laws, the Nazi state created a vast bureaucracy of racial classification. Germans were required to present proof of Aryan ancestry through official documents known as Ahnenpässe or ancestry passes. Genealogical charts, once the domain of family historians, now determined whether one could marry, work, or even remain safe from persecution. Those with one or two Jewish grandparents were labeled Mischling or mixed bloods, caught in the grey zones of discrimination. These individuals faced varying degrees of exclusion, sometimes spared from the harshest measures, but always marked as inferior. Bureaucrats pored over birth records, baptismal certificates, and synagogue archives, reducing human identity to cold categories. Friends and neighbors betrayed each other in disputes, using racial accusations as weapons in personal quarrels. The process blurred the line between private life and state surveillance, as identity became an administrative matter of life and death. By turning racial hatred into paperwork, the Nazis gave their ideology a facade of order and legitimacy. The horror lay in its normalcy. Every form stamped, every record filed, was another life diminished by law. Beyond the legal codes, the Nazis cultivated a culture of public humiliation to reinforce exclusion. Jews who violated racial laws, or even appeared to, were paraded through streets with placards declaring their shame. Neighbors were encouraged to denounce one another, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Signs sprouted on shop windows declaring Jews not wanted here, and entire towns proclaimed themselves Judenfrei, free of Jews. Jewish businesses were boycotted, often under orchestrated Nazi campaigns that pressured ordinary citizens to turn away. These boycotts were not simply economic measures but symbolic acts, erasing Jews from the shared spaces of markets, schools, and theaters. Children absorbed the message quickly, mocking classmates who were labeled as Jewish and internalizing the lessons of separation. Social clubs, sporting associations, and cultural groups expelled Jews, making isolation not just political but personal. With each exclusion, Jews were pushed further from the fabric of daily life, marked as outsiders in the land of their birth. The humiliation was relentless, and it was designed to break the spirit long before physical violence escalated. For many Jews, the experience of exclusion was disorienting and devastating. Families who had fought for Germany in World War I, who had considered themselves patriotic citizens, now found themselves cast as enemies within. Doctors who had treated wounded soldiers, professors who had educated generations of Germans, and artists who had enriched cultural life were suddenly shunned. The betrayal cut deeply, for it came not only from the government, but also from neighbors, colleagues, and friends. Some sought refuge abroad, sensing that life in Germany was becoming untenable, but emigration was fraught with obstacles and restrictions. Others clung to the hope that the madness would pass, that centuries of integration could not be so easily erased. Yet with each new decree, their world grew smaller, their dignity more eroded. Even those in mixed marriages faced constant anxiety, fearing denunciation and persecution. What had once been ordinary routines, visiting a doctor, sending a child to school, running a shop, became battles for survival in a society designed to exclude. The laws were not just legal measures, they were psychological weapons, turning belonging into exile within one's own home. The Nuremberg Laws also sent a chilling message to the world. International observers saw a modern European nation codifying racism with unprecedented openness. Newspapers reported on the spectacle of Nuremberg, where torchlit parades and speeches cloaked exclusion in grandeur. Some foreign governments protested quietly, while others, still reeling from the Great Depression, chose silence or appeasement. For Jews outside Germany, the laws confirmed that anti-Semitism was not a passing wave, but a rising tide. Refugee agencies struggled to find safe havens for those seeking to flee, but immigration quotas in countries like the United States and Britain remained limited. The lack of a robust international response emboldened the Nazis, signaling that persecution could continue with little consequence. The Nuremberg Laws thus became more than domestic policy. They were a declaration of intent, a step toward more radical measures. By stripping Jews of rights and dignity, without facing decisive global resistance, the regime tested the limits of what the world would tolerate. The results would prove catastrophic, as persecution evolved into annihilation. By the late 1930s, the web of exclusion was so tight that Jewish existence in Germany had been reduced to mere survival. Rights had been revoked, professions closed, marriages policed, and social spaces barred. The Nuremberg Laws had created a two-tiered society where Jews were legally and visibly marked as outsiders. What had begun as discriminatory rhetoric had now hardened into a structure of law, policing every aspect of life. These measures were not simply about exclusion, they were about preparation. By stripping Jews of citizenship and humanity, the Nazis laid the foundation for the violence that would follow. When ghettos were built, when deportations began, when camps arose, the legal groundwork was already in place. Each law, each decree, had accustomed society to view Jews not as neighbors, but as objects of policy. This gradual descent into exclusion ensured that when mass persecution escalated, it no longer shocked. It seemed like the next step. The Nuremberg Laws were thus not an endpoint, but a beginning, the scaffolding upon which genocide would be built. From the earliest days of Nazi rule, propaganda was the lifeblood of the regime, shaping thought as effectively as the Gestapo policed action. At the center of this machinery stood Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, a man who understood that control of the mind was as crucial as control of the state. Goebbels wielded newspapers, radio, cinema, literature, and art as weapons, saturating the German public with the Nazi worldview. Every headline, every speech, every poster was carefully crafted to stir emotion, rally loyalty, and direct hatred. In Nazi Germany, there was no such thing as neutral information. Everything was either propaganda or silence. Goebbels boasted that propaganda must be simple, repetitive, and emotional, appealing less to reason than to instinct. His ministry ensured that even the most remote villages received a steady flow of carefully tailored messages. Radios were subsidized so that every household could hear Hitler's voice, his speeches broadcast with ritualistic fervor. The omnipresence of propaganda created an atmosphere where Nazi ideology felt less like an opinion and more like reality itself. For millions of Germans, daily life was lived inside this carefully engineered echo chamber of lies. Newspapers were among the first tools seized in the propaganda war. Independent journalism was eradicated, and the press was brought under strict Nazi control. The notorious weekly Der Stürmer, edited by Julius Streicher, became a venomous mouthpiece of antisemitism. Its covers featured grotesque caricatures of Jews, depicting them as greedy, diseased, and dangerous. These images dehumanized Jews, planting seeds of suspicion and fear in readers who might never meet a Jewish person in their lives. Headlines screamed of Jewish conspiracies, linking Jews to communism, capitalism, and every perceived evil undermining Germany. Other newspapers echoed the same themes, repeating lies until they gained the sheen of truth. Readers found no alternative voices, for dissenting journalists had been silenced, imprisoned, or exiled. In coffee houses, workplaces, and homes, the stories repeated from these papers fueled a common narrative of Jewish guilt and German victimhood. By manipulating the press, Goebbels ensured that words on a page could transform into weapons sharper than any blade. Radio emerged as the regime's most powerful propaganda tool, reaching directly into the living rooms of millions. Known as the People's Receiver, the affordable Volksempfänger radio was designed to tune only to state-approved broadcasts. Through it, Hitler's speeches became national events, his voice amplified to sound commanding and infallible. Listeners gathered in homes, factories, and public squares where loudspeakers blared Nazi oratory to the masses. Goebbels ensured that music, news, and commentary all carried subtle undertones of the Nazi message. Even entertainment was crafted to reinforce loyalty, glorifying German culture and vilifying enemies. Foreign broadcasts were criminalized, with severe punishments for those caught tuning in. Radio created a sense of unity, as if the entire nation was bound together by the same words, the same rhythms, the same beat of ideology. The intimacy of the medium made Hitler seem not just a distant leader, but a constant presence in daily life. By monopolizing the airwaves, the Nazis turned sound itself into an instrument of obedience. Cinema became another battlefield of the mind, where images flickered larger than life and seeped into collective imagination. German film studios were brought under state control, producing movies that ranged from overtly anti-Semitic propaganda to historical epics glorifying German heroism. Films like Jude Seuss and The Eternal Jew presented Jews as corrupt, manipulative, and parasitic, embedding hatred in visual form. Documentaries such as Triumph of the Will, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, showcased Nazi rallies in breathtaking spectacle, making mass obedience appear beautiful, even sublime. Every scene was carefully choreographed to glorify Hitler as a visionary savior and the Nazi Party as an unstoppable force of destiny. Cinemas, filled night after night, became temples of indoctrination where audiences absorbed ideology through entertainment. Even children's cartoons carried subtle anti-Semitic tropes, teaching prejudice under the guise of laughter. For those who attended, the line between reality and propaganda blurred as fiction reinforced the lies of the regime. Film made hate emotional, visceral, and unforgettable. It ensured that ideology did not just inform thought, but invaded imagination. Posters and visual propaganda plastered the walls of cities and villages, ensuring that no street was free from Nazi imagery. Bold colors, simple slogans, and exaggerated symbols communicated messages even to those who could not read. Jews were depicted with hooked noses, greedy expressions, and shadowy figures lurking behind Germany's misfortunes. By contrast, the Aryan German was painted as strong, healthy, and noble, a visual embodiment of racial superiority. Posters linked Jews to rats, disease, and contamination, reinforcing the idea that they were not human but vermin. Campaigns urged Germans to boycott Jewish businesses, to reject racial pollution, and to embrace national unity. The sheer repetition of these images etched them into public consciousness, leaving no room for ambiguity. Children saw them on their way to school, workers on their way to factories, families on Sunday strolls. Propaganda was not confined to rallies or speeches. It was embedded in the visual landscape of everyday life. Every wall became a billboard of hate, normalizing exclusion and preparing the public for persecution. Education was perhaps the most insidious arena of indoctrination, where children were molded to become loyal servants of the Reich. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize racial purity, glorify German history, and vilify Jews as enemies of civilization. Math problems calculated the cost of caring for the disabled, normalizing eugenics through arithmetic. Biology lessons explained bloodlines and racial hierarchies, presenting pseudoscience as undeniable truth. Literature classes replaced Jewish and liberal authors with Nazi-approved works extolling nationalism. Teachers who resisted were dismissed, replaced by those who pledged loyalty to Hitler and his ideology. Beyond the classroom, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls provided extracurricular indoctrination. Boys learned military drills and physical toughness, preparing for war, while girls were taught domestic skills and the duty to produce racially pure children. Songs, chants, and rituals bound children emotionally to the regime, creating an identity fused with Nazism from the earliest age. Through education, the Nazis ensured that indoctrination was not temporary but generational. Children were taught not only what to think, but how to think. The effectiveness of propaganda lay in its ability to blend with everyday life, seeping into culture, leisure, and private thought. Sporting events became showcases of Nazi pride, with the 1936 Berlin Olympics turned into a spectacle of Aryan strength and unity. Even fashion, music, and art were policed to ensure conformity with Nazi ideals. Families were encouraged to subscribe to Nazi magazines, read approved novels, and decorate their homes with portraits of Hitler. Public holidays and rituals revolved around Nazi mythology, transforming the calendar into a constant reminder of ideology. Goebbels understood that propaganda had to be more than information. It had to be an atmosphere. By saturating daily existence, the Nazis created a society where alternative perspectives were not just suppressed, but unthinkable. In such an environment, hatred of Jews did not feel imposed but natural, woven into the fabric of life. Propaganda achieved what brute force alone could not. It colonized the human mind. The result was a society prepared to accept and even participate in persecution. Propaganda and indoctrination formed the psychological foundation of the Holocaust. By the late 1930s, Germans had been conditioned to view Jews not as neighbors but as threats, undeserving of sympathy or rights. Decades of anti-Semitic tropes had been distilled into a new intensity, reinforced daily through words, images, and rituals. When violence erupted, when windows were smashed, when deportations began, many saw not horror, but confirmation of what they had been taught. Propaganda had dulled empathy, numbed conscience, and replaced human connection with fear and suspicion. Children raised on these messages would grow into soldiers, guards, and bureaucrats who carried out atrocities with chilling normalcy. Ordinary citizens, steeped in propaganda, became passive bystanders or active collaborators. The power of Goebbels' machine was not only in what it said, but in how thoroughly it silenced everything else. By monopolizing imagination and thought, the Nazis paved the road from prejudice to genocide. Propaganda had not merely prepared the Holocaust, it had made it possible. On the evening of November 9, 1938, across towns and cities in Germany and Austria, the quiet of night was shattered by a storm of orchestrated violence. Shop windows exploded in showers of glass, giving rise to the name Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Synagogues, some centuries old, were set ablaze while firefighters stood by, ordered not to intervene. Jewish homes were invaded by mobs who smashed furniture, ripped open cupboards, and hurled belongings into the streets. Families, paralyzed with fear, cowered as men in Nazi uniforms or civilian clothes shouted threats and insults. This was not spontaneous anger. It was a carefully coordinated pogrom, directed from the highest levels of Nazi leadership. By dawn, streets were littered with shards, charred prayer books, and the remnants of shattered lives. The air reeked of smoke and ash as sacred scrolls were reduced to cinders. Ordinary Germans, some complicit, others silent, walked past the wreckage the next morning as if it were an unfortunate but justified event. Kristallnacht marked a terrifying turning point, where discrimination leapt from laws and words into organized nationwide violence. The pretext for Kristallnacht came from the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris, Ernst von Rath. His attacker was Herschel Grinspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jew whose family had been expelled from Germany and stranded at the border in appalling conditions. Nazi leaders seized upon this tragedy, twisting it into an excuse for retribution against all Jews. Joseph Goebbels delivered a fiery speech on November 9th, stoking rage and hinting at the need for immediate action. Within hours, orders spread through Nazi Party channels, police stations and local officials. Stormtroopers, Hitler Youth, and civilians sympathetic to the regime were mobilized for destruction. This was no chaotic riot. It was a signal from the top disguised as public outrage. The assassination was manipulated into a justification for collective punishment, ignoring its individual context. By weaponizing a single event, the regime transformed simmering prejudice into a nationwide eruption of violence. It revealed how propaganda and policy could combine into orchestrated terror with terrifying speed. The destruction that night was vast and deliberate, targeting the very heart of Jewish communal life. Over 1,400 synagogues and prayer houses were vandalized or burned to the ground, their flames lighting up the night sky in dozens of towns. Torah scrolls, the sacred words of Jewish faith, were hurled into the streets, torn apart and trampled underfoot. Cemeteries were desecrated, gravestones smashed as if to erase the memory of entire generations. Jewish schools, cultural centers, and businesses were systematically looted and destroyed. The glass that carpeted the streets symbolized not only broken property, but the shattering of any illusion of security for Jews in the Reich. Firefighters were instructed to protect adjacent non-Jewish buildings while letting synagogues burn to their foundations. Neighbors, whether fearful or eager, watched from windows as the destruction unfolded, some even cheering as flames consumed sacred structures. For Jews who survived that night, the devastation was not just physical but spiritual, an assault on their identity and history. Kristallnacht was a deliberate effort to make Jewish life unlivable within Germany. Alongside the destruction came brutal physical violence against Jewish individuals. Nazi gangs dragged men from their homes, beating them in the streets as families screamed helplessly. Some were forced to watch as their shops were looted or burned, their livelihoods erased in hours. Others were humiliated, stripped of dignity, paraded through towns in acts designed to degrade. By the end of the pogrom, approximately 100 Jews were murdered, though the true number was likely higher, hidden by official reports. Thousands more were injured, scarred both physically and psychologically. The violence was not blind chaos, but targeted cruelty, meant to terrorize Jews into submission. The attackers operated with confidence, knowing that law enforcement had been instructed to look the other way. Jewish men who tried to defend themselves were beaten more harshly or shot outright. Kristallnacht transformed anti-Semitic rhetoric into physical terror, sending an unmistakable message that Jewish lives were no longer protected under German law. One of the most chilling aspects of Kristallnacht was the role of the state in orchestrating and enabling the violence. Police forces and SS units were ordered not to protect Jews or their property, but to arrest them en masse. By November 10th, nearly 30,000 Jewish men had been rounded up and sent to concentration camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. For many, this was their first encounter with the machinery of imprisonment that would later expand into industrialized extermination. Families were left shattered as fathers and sons vanished overnight into a system of terror. The arrests were intended not only to punish but to cripple Jewish communities, removing their leaders and breadwinners. Meanwhile, Nazi authorities cynically fined Jewish communities for the damages, forcing victims to pay for the destruction inflicted upon them. Insurance claims were confiscated by the state, turning the pogrom into an opportunity for theft on a massive scale. Bureaucrats drafted orders with cold precision, reducing human suffering to calculations on paper. The complicity of the state revealed that this was not mob violence, it was government policy carried out in plain sight. The international reaction to Kristallnacht was one of outrage, yet ultimately shallow in consequence. Newspapers around the world printed shocking images of burning synagogues and shattered shops. Political leaders condemned the brutality, with US President Franklin D.D. Roosevelt recalling the American ambassador from Berlin in protest. Britain relaxed immigration restrictions for Jewish children, leading to the Kindertransport program that saved thousands. Yet despite words of condemnation, few nations were willing to open their doors widely to Jewish refugees. Immigration quotas, economic concerns, and deep-seated anti-Semitism limited meaningful action. For Jews trapped inside Germany, the world's sympathy felt hollow, a gesture without rescue. Nazi leaders observed this muted response and concluded that they could act with impunity. Kristallnacht, instead of being a warning that restrained the regime, emboldened Hitler and his circle. The failure of the world to intervene became part of the path to genocide. For German Jews, Kristallnacht was a breaking point, shattering any lingering belief that they could endure the Nazi regime by keeping their heads down. Until then, many had clung to the hope that persecution would fade, or that loyalty to Germany as a homeland would shield them. The pogrom made it unmistakably clear Jews had no future under Nazi rule. Families scrambled to find ways to emigrate, selling possessions, pleading for visas, and enduring endless bureaucratic obstacles. Synagogues that once anchored communities were now ashes, leaving survivors spiritually adrift. Children who had attended Jewish schools returned to find classrooms destroyed and books burned. Merchants who had built businesses over generations stood before smashed storefronts, their life's work obliterated overnight. The sense of belonging, already frayed, was ripped away completely. Kristallnacht marked the moment when Jewish existence in Germany shifted from marginalization to outright persecution. It was the night that turned fear into despair, and despair into flight. In hindsight, Kristallnacht was more than just a pogrom. It was a signal fire for the Holocaust to come. The destruction of November 1938 demonstrated the regime's willingness to unleash violence openly, without fear of domestic or international backlash. It normalized the arrest and imprisonment of Jews, preparing the infrastructure for mass deportations. It showed ordinary Germans that attacks on Jews would be tolerated, even celebrated by the state. For many perpetrators, it was a rehearsal in brutality, testing how far they could go without consequence. For victims, it was the moment when hope of assimilation or endurance gave way to the grim realization of mortal danger. The broken glass that glittered in the streets was more than debris, It was a mirror reflecting a future of escalating terror. From that night onward, Jews were no longer citizens, neighbors, or Germans, they were targets. Kristallnacht transformed prejudice into policy and policy into violence. It was the night when the Nazi regime stepped irreversibly onto the path of genocide. After the shock of Kristallnacht, Jewish existence in Nazi Germany, and soon in occupied Europe, shrank into a suffocating web of restrictions and humiliations. The daily oppression was designed not only to control, but to degrade, eroding dignity, one decree at a time. Jews were banned from theaters, parks, and public spaces, cutting them off from ordinary life. They were forced to hand over radios, typewriters, bicycles, and later even pets, stripping away independence and comfort. Their shops and businesses were confiscated under the guise of Aryanization, transferring assets to loyal Nazis or German citizens at bargain prices. Identification cards were stamped with a red J, passports defaced with the names Israel or Sarah to mark them as outsiders. Street signs appeared forbidding Jews from walking on certain sidewalks, benches were labeled for Aryans only, and neighborhoods became zones of exclusion. Ordinary acts like buying bread or taking a tram became loaded with danger and humiliation. Jews learned to walk with their eyes down, avoiding confrontation, surviving by invisibility. The world they once knew shrank into a narrow cage of restrictions that tightened with each passing month. With the German invasion of Poland in 1939, this cage expanded into an entire system of control over millions of Jews. The Nazis now presided over the largest Jewish population in Europe, and their policies hardened into mechanisms of segregation. In occupied cities like Warsaw, Łódź, and Kraków, Jews were herded into confined urban districts that would soon become infamous ghettos. Families were given hours or days to leave their homes, often forced to abandon possessions too heavy to carry. Crowded apartments designed for one family suddenly housed 5 or 6, with mattresses on floors and no privacy. Barbed wire, brick walls, or armed patrols sealed the borders, making escape impossible. Curfews enforced by threats of shooting restricted movement even further, ensuring total dependency on Nazi authorities. To cross a street without permission could mean death. The ghettos were meant not only to isolate, but to dehumanize, turning thriving communities into desperate enclaves of survival. For Jews trapped behind the walls, every day became a negotiation between hunger, fear, and the will to live. Inside the ghettos, life was marked by deprivation on a scale that tested human endurance. Food rations for Jews were deliberately set far below subsistence levels, just a few hundred calories per day. Black markets flourished, with smuggled bread, potatoes, or onions fetching impossible prices. Children risked their lives crawling through sewers or gaps in walls to bring food from outside, often shot if caught. Disease spread rapidly in the overcrowded conditions, with typhus and tuberculosis claiming thousands. Hospitals were overwhelmed, medicine scarce, and doctors forced to improvise with limited supplies. Funerals became daily occurrences, and cemeteries expanded at alarming speed. Families burned furniture for warmth in freezing winters, huddling together in unheated rooms. Schooling was forbidden, but underground classes continued in secret, with teachers determined to keep culture and hope alive. Music, theater, and even poetry readings emerged in hidden spaces, as communities fought to retain their humanity. Survival was not only about food, but about preserving identity in the face of erasure. Beyond hunger and disease, there was the crushing weight of humiliation, carried out through daily acts of cruelty. Jews were forced to bow to German soldiers, to sweep streets with toothbrushes, or to kneel in public squares as onlookers laughed. Beards were torn out, prayer shawls desecrated, and sacred rituals mocked. German officers often staged brutal games, beating or killing individuals for sport, instilling terror through spectacle. Signs hung around victims' necks proclaimed fabricated crimes like "I bought bread illegally" or "I tried to leave the ghetto." Children witnessed their parents degraded, powerless to intervene, absorbing fear as the fabric of family strength frayed. Forced labor further deepened the suffering, as Jews were conscripted into building roads, digging trenches, or clearing rubble for the war effort. Hours were long, tools inadequate, and beatings constant, turning work into slow torture. Yet despite exhaustion, many clung to labor as a slim chance of survival, hoping productivity might shield them from deportation. Humiliation was a weapon wielded daily, breaking spirits as effectively as hunger broke bodies. Nazi rule transformed Jewish existence into a relentless series of impossible choices. Families debated whether to trade heirlooms for food or save them for bribes that might someday be needed. Mothers chose between feeding a child or an elderly parent, while fathers agonized over whether to risk smuggling or remain passive. Some cooperated with Jewish councils, the Judenräte, formed under Nazi orders to administer the ghettos. These councils were trapped in an impossible position, caught between trying to alleviate suffering and carrying out Nazi commands. They organized food distribution, sanitation, and labor assignments, often under threat of execution. Resentment grew as desperate Jews saw them as complicit, even when choices were dictated at gunpoint. Smugglers were simultaneously condemned and celebrated, despised for their prices but revered for keeping communities alive. Trust dissolved as neighbors suspected one another of collaboration or betrayal. Life under Nazi rule was designed to fracture unity, leaving Jewish communities isolated, weakened, and vulnerable. In this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, survival itself became an act of resistance. Despite the suffocating oppression, ghettos were not devoid of resilience. Cultural life, though forbidden, emerged defiantly in the shadows. Rabbis held secret services, lighting candles in basements where whispered prayers defied Nazi decrees. Teachers gathered small groups of children, passing on knowledge as an act of rebellion against enforced ignorance. Musicians played in hidden rooms, lifting spirits with melodies that reminded listeners of better days. Writers recorded diaries and chronicles, determined that future generations would know the truth of their suffering. Artists sketched scenes of hunger and despair, capturing both pain and resilience on scraps of paper. These acts of cultural survival provided dignity where Nazis sought only degradation. Even humor survived, with jokes circulating in whispers, poking holes in the illusion of Nazi invincibility. Such resilience was not just cultural, it was existential, a refusal to surrender humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. For many, preserving dignity became the ultimate form of defiance. The psychological toll of life under Nazi rule cannot be overstated. Constant fear of raids, deportations, and executions eroded the mental health of entire communities. Children grew up too quickly, absorbing lessons of silence, caution, and mistrust. Parents, once providers and protectors, struggled with the guilt of being powerless against forces beyond comprehension. Couples faced strain as families argued over impossible decisions of survival, straining bonds forged in love. Anxiety filled every hour as rumors of deportation spread like wildfire, and each knock on the door brought panic. Depression and despair were widespread, yet so too was a stubborn will to endure. People found meaning in the smallest acts, sharing a crust of bread, reciting a prayer, telling a story at night. Hope flickered in conversations about liberation, often fueled by distant radio broadcasts, smuggled in at great risk. But each day that passed under Nazi rule deepened the sense that life had become a waiting game against death. The ghettos were prisons of the body, but even more profoundly, prisons of the soul. By the early 1940s, the ghettos and daily oppression of Nazi rule were revealed not as the final stage, but as a prelude to something far darker. The walls that confined millions of Jews were not built merely for containment, but for eventual annihilation. The forced labor, the rationing, the humiliation. These were steps in a process of dehumanization designed to prepare victims and perpetrators alike for genocide. For the Nazis, ghettos became holding pens where populations could be concentrated, weakened, and made manageable for mass deportations. For Jews, they were both a graveyard of culture and a training ground of resilience, where every breath was an act of defiance. Kristallnacht had announced the end of Jewish security. Life under Nazi rule announced the end of Jewish freedom. The ghettos stood as a terrible threshold, where survival seemed possible, but the horizon hid catastrophe. Every restriction, every act of humiliation, every hunger pang carried within it the shadow of a larger plan. Soon those shadows would take form in trains, camps, and smoke rising from chimneys. When Hitler unleashed war on September 1st, 1939, by invading Poland, the persecution of Jews entered an entirely new and more brutal phase. What had begun as legal discrimination, economic dispossession, and street violence now transformed into military occupation and systematic oppression across vast territories. Poland, home to over 3 million Jews, became the first testing ground for Nazi policies that blended conquest with racial ideology. German troops marched into towns and cities with orders not only to secure control, but also to terrorize Jewish populations. Homes were raided, shops looted, and synagogues desecrated within days of the invasion. Forced labor was introduced immediately, with Jews compelled to clear rubble, repair roads, and carry out degrading tasks under armed guard. Communities that had existed for centuries suddenly found themselves stripped of leaders, as rabbis, intellectuals, and professionals were arrested or executed. German authorities marked Jewish property for confiscation, taking over businesses and redistributing wealth to so-called Aryan settlers. From the outset, persecution was inseparable from the war effort, feeding both Nazi ideology and the material needs of occupation. The invasion of Poland did not merely expand the Reich, it expanded the machinery of hatred. Ghettos became the centerpiece of Nazi policy in occupied Poland, creating a new geography of oppression that confined millions of Jews to walled districts. Warsaw, Gouda, Kraków, and dozens of smaller cities saw neighborhoods sealed off with barbed wire, brick walls, or wooden fences. Families were expelled from their homes, given little time to gather belongings, and herded into overcrowded quarters. Apartments meant for a single household often held 5 or 6 families, with no heating, sanitation, or privacy. Nazi officials enforced strict curfews, rationed food at starvation levels, and made any attempt to leave punishable by death. German guards patrolled entrances, while collaborators were tasked with enforcing internal order, creating divisions within Jewish communities. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, with typhus becoming an epidemic due to overcrowding and lack of medicine. Starvation was deliberate policy, with daily rations for Jews sometimes amounting to only a few hundred calories. Ghettos were not only cages, but also waiting rooms for an even more sinister fate that had not yet fully revealed itself. To the outside world, they appeared as zones of containment. In reality, they were the first stage of destruction. As the German army moved eastward, Another instrument of terror emerged behind its advancing lines, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, composed of SS men, police units, and collaborators. These death squads followed the Wehrmacht into newly conquered territories. Their mission was not military, but ideological, to eliminate undesirable elements such as Jews, communists, Roma, and political opponents. They operated with chilling efficiency, often arriving in towns and compiling lists of Jewish leaders, intellectuals, and community figures. Victims were marched to forests, fields, or ravines, forced to dig their own graves, and executed en masse by firing squads. Entire communities vanished within days, their deaths recorded in meticulous reports sent back to Berlin. Villagers often witnessed the massacres, and sometimes local collaborators assisted, adding to the atmosphere of terror. The shootings were brutal and personal, requiring face-to-face killing that scarred perpetrators as much as it annihilated victims. The Einsatzgruppen represented a transition from persecution to mass murder, showing that Nazi plans had already crossed the line into genocide. In the shadows of these operations, the Holocaust was no longer an abstract vision, but a bloody reality. The largest and most infamous of these early massacres occurred at Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev, in September 1941. Over 2 days, more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were rounded up, stripped of belongings, and shot in mass pits. German soldiers, police units, and local collaborators coordinated the slaughter with chilling precision. Families were told they were being relocated, only to be marched to their deaths. Eyewitnesses recalled the sound of machine guns echoing through the ravine, the cries of children, and the silence that followed. Bodies were piled layer upon layer, as firing squads worked in shifts to maintain their pace. Survivors who attempted to escape were hunted down, and those who returned to the ravine later saw earth still heaving from the pits below. Babi Yar was not an isolated event, but one of hundreds of similar massacres across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had killed more than 500,000 Jews, erasing entire towns from the map. These killings marked the Holocaust by bullets, a phase of intimate slaughter that left no doubt about Nazi intent. For Jews forced into ghettos, the reality of Nazi expansion was both immediate and suffocating. Every aspect of daily life was controlled, from the amount of food one could eat to the hours one was allowed outside. Smuggling became a lifeline, with children often slipping through cracks in walls or sewer systems to bring in bread or potatoes. Those caught were beaten or shot, but hunger drove desperate risks. Inside, cultural life clung to existence in the form of secret schools, prayer gatherings, and underground newspapers. Diaries and chronicles documented the slow death of communities, determined that history would remember their suffering. The ghettos also became laboratories of survival strategies, from bartering to forming resistance groups. Yet each act of survival took place under the shadow of German decrees that grew harsher with time. Deportations began quietly, with promises of resettlement that concealed the reality of extermination. By 1940 and 1941, the ghettos were not just prisons, they were staging grounds for the Holocaust. The Nazi war of conquest meant persecution spread wherever German troops advanced. In Western Europe, Jews in countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands faced new regulations: registration, forced wearing of yellow stars, and confiscation of property. While ghettos were less common in the West, concentration camps and deportations soon became central. In the East, however, the brutality was immediate and absolute. Jewish populations in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were almost entirely wiped out by local collaborators working alongside German death squads. In the Balkans, Allied regimes like Hungary and Romania enforced their own versions of anti-Jewish laws, often competing in cruelty. Across occupied Europe, persecution was tailored to local conditions, but always pointed toward the same goal: annihilation. For Jews, the outbreak of war was not just geopolitical, it was personal, immediate, and lethal. Every advance of German troops meant new ghettos, new massacres, and new decrees stripping away the last remnants of freedom. Expansion of Nazi power was expansion of death. The machinery of persecution relied on both Nazi planning and local collaboration. While German authorities dictated policy, they often relied on local police, officials, and even neighbors to enforce it. In Poland, Ukrainian auxiliaries and Lithuanian militias joined the killings. In France, the Vichy regime eagerly identified and rounded up Jews for deportation. In Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, governments passed their own anti-Jewish laws, mimicking German models. Ordinary civilians also played roles, betraying neighbors, looting Jewish homes, or taking over confiscated businesses. This complicity widened the scope of persecution far beyond what German manpower alone could achieve. For Jews, betrayal became a daily fear. No one knew which acquaintance might turn informer. Collaboration exposed the frightening reality that persecution was not just an imposition from above, but a phenomenon that penetrated local societies. The Holocaust was global in reach precisely because hatred and opportunism made it local. By 1941 and 1942, the expansion of persecution had laid the foundation for the final solution. Ghettos confined millions of Jews, death squads had already murdered hundreds of thousands, and collaboration networks were entrenched across occupied Europe. The policies of exclusion had evolved into mechanisms of extermination, though the methods were still inconsistent. For the Nazis, the challenge was no longer whether Jews should be destroyed, but how to kill them more efficiently. The ghettos could not contain so many for long, and the Einsatzgruppen massacres, though effective, strained manpower and morale. The search for solutions led directly to the conception of extermination camps, industrialized killing designed to complete what bullets and starvation had begun. The war that Hitler unleashed thus became inseparable from the genocide he had long promised. By expanding German control, he expanded the reach of persecution, drawing millions more into its grasp. In the wake of conquest, Jewish life across Europe was pushed to the brink of annihilation, and the machinery of death was only beginning to find its most lethal form. The Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939 brought millions of Jews under German control, and almost immediately the occupiers sought to segregate them from the rest of the population. The solution was the creation of ghettos, sealed-off districts where Jews were forced to live in confinement under degrading conditions. Warsaw, home to the largest Jewish community in Europe, became the site of the largest ghetto, confining nearly 500,000 people within just a few square miles. In Howard, the second largest ghetto, barbed wire and guard posts turned an ordinary city district into a vast prison. Across occupied Poland, from Krakow to Lublin, Jewish neighborhoods were walled in, creating an artificial world of suffering and scarcity. Families were expelled from their homes with little notice, often allowed only a suitcase or a bundle of belongings. The Germans seized Jewish property for redistribution, leaving survivors crammed into overcrowded tenements. Streets once filled with trade, music, and daily chatter became narrow corridors of despair patrolled by armed guards. The ghettos were not accidental but deliberate, part of a calculated plan to isolate Jews and strip them of all means of survival. By 1940, the ghettos had become a defining feature of Nazi rule in the East, reshaping Jewish life into a struggle for existence. Inside the ghettos, Life was marked by overcrowding so severe that entire families often shared a single room. Apartments meant for 2 or 3 people now held 10 or more, with mattresses spread across floors and no privacy left. Ventilation was poor, sanitation was nearly non-existent, and clean water was scarce. Human waste often collected in open gutters, fueling outbreaks of disease that swept through the population unchecked. Typhus became one of the deadliest killers, thriving in the cramped and unhygienic conditions. Medical care was either forbidden or heavily restricted, with Jewish doctors forced to improvise treatments using herbs, scraps, and contraband medicines smuggled in from outside. Mortality rose daily, with funerals becoming a grim routine that overwhelmed cemeteries. Children, already weakened by hunger, were especially vulnerable, and their cries of sickness echoed through dark courtyards. Entire neighborhoods reeked of illness and decay, as suffering became inescapable. The ghettos were, in effect, engineered death traps, designed to weaken Jewish communities before their final destruction. Starvation was not merely a byproduct of ghetto life. It was central to Nazi policy. German authorities rationed food at levels that ensured slow but certain death, often providing only 200 to 300 calories per person per day. Bread was coarse, made with sawdust or fillers, and potatoes, when available, were considered luxuries. Meat, milk, and sugar disappeared almost entirely, leaving families to survive on thin soups and scraps. Malnutrition quickly became visible, as children's limbs grew stick-thin and adults' faces sank into skeletal hollows. Desperate families sold clothing, furniture, and even wedding rings on the black market in exchange for morsels of food. Smuggling became a lifeline, especially for children, who could slip through cracks in fences or crawl through sewers to reach the outside world. Many were caught and beaten, sometimes executed on the spot, but hunger left no other choice. Mothers often sacrificed their portions to keep children alive a little longer, while fathers risked their lives in underground trading networks. The deliberate cruelty of hunger reduced thriving communities to shadows of their former selves, eroding strength, dignity, and hope. The ghettos were not only sites of deprivation, but also arenas of constant humiliation. German soldiers and police patrolled the perimeters, staging raids that terrorized residents. Jews were often forced to perform degrading tasks in public, from scrubbing streets to kneeling in mud while passers-by jeered. Random beatings and arrests kept the population in a state of permanent fear. Religious and cultural practices were disrupted, with synagogues desecrated or repurposed as storage facilities. Schools were closed, forcing children to learn secretly in cramped basements where makeshift classrooms sprang up. Weddings and funerals continued, but always under the shadow of surveillance and threat. Even laughter, music, or a moment of joy felt dangerous, as German guards treated such acts as defiance. Life in the ghettos was a daily assault, not only on survival but on the very idea of human dignity. Every street corner became a reminder that Jewish life was being systematically dismantled in both body and spirit. Jewish councils, known as Judenräte, were established by the Nazis in every ghetto, creating a layer of administration under impossible conditions. These councils were forced to carry out German orders, including registering residents, organizing labor, and distributing scarce food rations. Leaders like Adam Czerniaków in Warsaw faced moral dilemmas daily, caught between cooperating with the occupiers or risking collective punishment. Many sought to alleviate suffering where they could, arranging soup kitchens, orphanages, and medical aid despite crippling shortages. Yet the councils were also tasked with implementing deportation lists when German authorities demanded resettlements. This role condemned them in the eyes of many, creating painful divisions within communities already torn by hunger and fear. Some council members collaborated willingly, hoping to preserve power or privilege, while others tried desperately to shield as many lives as possible. The tragedy of the Judenräte lay in the fact that no decision could ever truly save the community. Their existence was a cruel manipulation by the Nazis, who used Jewish leaders as instruments of control. In the end, the councils were as powerless as the people they represented, trapped in a system designed to destroy them. Despite these unbearable conditions, the ghettos were not devoid of resilience or cultural life. Underground schools operated in secret, ensuring that children continued to learn even as hunger gnawed at their bodies. Musicians played in hidden rooms, and poets wrote verses that captured both despair and defiance. Religious leaders held clandestine services, lighting candles and whispering prayers, determined to keep faith alive. Theatrical performances, lectures, and even art exhibitions took place in basements, offering moments of beauty amid ruin. Smuggled books and hand-copied newspapers circulated, keeping people informed and connected to the outside world. Diaries, like those of Emanuel Ringelblum in Warsaw, documented every detail of ghetto life, preserving testimony for a future that seemed uncertain. These cultural acts were more than distractions, they were declarations that Jewish life still had meaning. Resistance took many forms, not only armed but also intellectual, spiritual, and emotional. In the ghettos, survival itself became an act of defiance against a regime that sought total annihilation. Children played a unique and heartbreaking role in ghetto survival. Because of their small size, they were often tasked with smuggling food, crawling through cracks in walls, or slipping past distracted guards. Many were caught, beaten, or shot, yet their efforts kept entire families alive for a few more weeks. Childhood in the ghettos was thus stolen, replaced by danger, hunger, and the burden of responsibility. At the same time, children became symbols of hope, their laughter and presence reminders of what might endure beyond the nightmare. Orphaned children crowded streets, begging for scraps or shelter, embodying the full cruelty of Nazi policy. Relief organizations within the ghettos tried to care for them, creating makeshift orphanages that provided food and shelter when possible. Yet resources were always scarce, and many children perished before help could reach them. Diaries written by young people, such as those of Dolweed Sirakowiak, reveal an unflinching portrait of life through the eyes of youth. Their words stand as enduring testimony, preserving innocence even as the world around them collapsed. In every sense, the children of the ghettos became both victims and chroniclers of unimaginable suffering. By 1942, the ghettos had fulfilled their grim purpose as holding pens for mass deportations. German authorities began liquidating them, deporting tens of thousands at a time to extermination camps such as Treblinka, Chelmno, and Auschwitz. Trains crammed with men, women, and children departed daily, their destinations cloaked in lies about resettlement and work opportunities. In Warsaw, entire streets fell silent as families were torn apart, neighbors vanishing overnight in waves of deportations. Togi, under the ruthless leadership of Chaim Rumkolsky, was transformed into a labor ghetto, delaying liquidation through relentless exploitation of Jewish labor. Yet even here, survival was temporary, as deportations eventually claimed the lives of nearly all residents. The ghettos that had once pulsed with secret schools, underground markets, and cultural life became empty shells, their streets littered with abandoned belongings. For those who remained, resistance became the final answer, culminating in uprisings that defied the Nazis even in the face of certain death. The ghettos were thus both prisons and battlegrounds, symbols of oppression and of courage. They stand in history as the cruel staging grounds for genocide, where survival itself was resistance against annihilation. On June 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, aimed at conquering the Soviet Union. Nearly 4 million German and Axis soldiers poured across the eastern frontier, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. For the Wehrmacht, this was framed as a crusade against communism, but for the Nazi leadership, it was also a racial war of extermination. The Slavic peoples were regarded as inferior, and the Jewish population of the Soviet Union was seen as the ultimate enemy. The invasion was not only a military campaign, but also a political and ideological project that fused conquest with genocide. Behind the advancing army came mobile killing squads known as the Einsatzgruppen, whose mission was to eliminate Jews, communists, intellectuals, and other undesirable groups. As the Wehrmacht captured town after town, the Einsatzgruppen followed, organizing massacres in forests, ravines, and open fields. Villages were surrounded, men separated from women, and entire communities executed within days. Unlike earlier persecution, which focused on confinement and humiliation, Barbarossa unleashed direct mass murder on an industrial scale. By the summer's end, the Eastern Front had become the testing ground for the final solution. The rapid German advance created chaos across the Soviet territories, overwhelming local populations unprepared for such sudden violence. In places like Lithuania, Latvia, and Ukraine, Einsatzgruppen units were supported by local collaborators who shared anti-Semitic beliefs or sought revenge against communists. Jews were rounded up in marketplaces, ordered to march to remote areas, and executed in mass shootings that shocked even some German soldiers. Unlike the camps, these killings were immediate, face-to-face, and intensely personal, with victims forced to dig their own graves before being shot. In the forests of Lithuania, entire shtetls disappeared within days, their centuries-old communities erased by bullets. Children were not spared, infants were shot alongside mothers, while the elderly collapsed on the roads as they were herded toward death sites. The Wehrmacht, though not officially tasked with genocide, often facilitated these massacres by providing logistical support, cordoning off areas, or even directly participating. Photographs taken by soldiers and hidden in personal albums captured scenes of unimaginable cruelty, evidence later used in war crimes trials. The speed of these massacres was staggering, tens of thousands killed in a single week. The invasion thus transformed Eastern Europe into a graveyard long before gas chambers were built. One of the most infamous massacres of Operation Barbarossa took place at Babi Yar, a ravine on the outskirts of Kiev, in late September 1941. After the Germans accused the city's Jewish population of aiding Soviet sabotage, orders were issued for all Jews to gather with their belongings. Over 2 days, September 29th and 30, more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children were marched to the ravine under the false pretense of resettlement. Once there, they were forced to undress, surrender valuables, and lie face down in rows along the edge of the ravine. Einsatzgruppen units, assisted by German police and local collaborators, opened fire in systematic bursts, layer upon layer of bodies filling the pit. The noise of gunfire and screams echoed across the city, yet the killing continued without pause. By the end, the ravine had become a mass grave, its soil soaked with blood and corpses buried hastily under thin layers of earth. Survivors who crawled out at night were hunted down in the following days. Babi Yar became a symbol of the Holocaust by bullets, a reminder that the machinery of genocide did not always require camps or trains. It marked the transition from persecution to outright annihilation in the East. The Einsatzgruppen, divided into four main groups labeled A through D, operated with chilling efficiency across the vast occupied territories. Each group followed a path aligned with the advance of German army groups, ensuring that no major town or village escaped their attention. Their reports, meticulously sent back to Berlin, detailed the numbers killed with bureaucratic precision, reducing human lives to tallies on paper. In Lithuania alone, Einsatzgruppe A reported the murder of over 130,000 Jews by the end of 1941. Einsatzgruppe C, active in Ukraine, carried out the massacre at Babi Yar, as well as countless other executions in smaller towns. Mobile killing units often used local police forces to round up victims, turning neighbors into executioners. Victims were frequently shot in secluded forests, their graves dug in advance by Soviet prisoners of war. These shootings were not random but carefully organized, with logistical planning rivaling that of military operations. Witnesses later testified to the cold professionalism with which the units carried out their mission. By the winter of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered over 500,000 Jews, laying the groundwork for the industrialized genocide that would soon follow. For the victims, life under occupation quickly collapsed into terror and despair. Jewish families fled deeper into the Soviet Union when possible, though many were trapped by the speed of the German advance. Those who remained faced decrees requiring yellow stars, forced labor, and the confiscation of property. Communities that had existed for centuries found themselves dismantled in weeks. Villages that had celebrated festivals, weddings, and traditions for generations now became sites of mass graves. Survivors described the silence after massacres, the absence of singing, market chatter, and children's laughter in once vibrant shuttles. In towns like Minsk and Smolensk, ghettos were created as holding points before extermination, further concentrating Jewish populations for easy destruction. Families clung to rumors of survival, only to see entire communities march to the edge of forests. Those who attempted to hide often depended on the courage of non-Jewish neighbors, who risked execution if discovered. Yet even acts of kindness were overshadowed by the relentless brutality of Nazi occupation, which left few safe havens in the East. The Holocaust by bullets was psychologically devastating not only for victims, but also for perpetrators. German soldiers and police units, untrained for mass executions, sometimes broke down after repeated killings. To maintain morale, commanders introduced alcohol before shootings, dulling consciences with liquor. Orders were clear: refusal to participate risked punishment, though in many cases soldiers could step aside with no severe consequences. Some chose to walk away, but many complied, citing obedience, peer pressure, or indoctrination. Executioners described haunting nightmares and lifelong guilt, though others boasted of their deeds with chilling pride. The Nazi leadership understood the limits of shooting as a method. It was too visible, too personal, and too psychologically taxing for mass implementation. These limitations prompted experiments with gas vans, which first appeared in 1941, suffocating victims with exhaust fumes. The shootings of Operation Barbarossa, however, revealed that genocide could be carried out swiftly and systematically, even without industrialized technology. They also served as a brutal rehearsal for the final solution, proving that entire populations could be erased in months. In this way, the invasion of the Soviet Union escalated Nazi policy from persecution into full-scale extermination. Local collaboration played a crucial role in expanding the scale of the massacres. In many occupied territories, pre-existing antisemitism made neighbors complicit in the destruction of Jewish communities. Some participated willingly, motivated by hatred, greed, or the promise of seized property. Others cooperated out of fear, threatened with death if they resisted German orders. Militia groups in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Belarus often carried out killings themselves under German supervision. Photographs show villagers watching executions, sometimes cheering as victims were led to their deaths. Entire communities became complicit, blurring the line between occupier and local executioner. For Jewish survivors, betrayal by neighbors added another layer of trauma, shattering bonds that had endured for generations. In contrast, a small minority of locals risked everything to shelter Jews in barns, cellars, and forests, demonstrating that acts of humanity were still possible even in times of mass cruelty. Yet these cases were exceptions, overshadowed by the widespread collaboration that made genocide efficient across the vast territories of the East. The Holocaust in the Soviet Union thus became not only a German project, but a tragedy woven into the fabric of occupied societies. By the end of 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union had fundamentally changed the trajectory of the Holocaust. What began as mass shootings, alongside military conquest, evolved into a genocidal policy aimed at exterminating every Jew in the East. The Einsatzgruppen's success in murdering entire communities emboldened Nazi leaders to expand their vision of annihilation. Reports from the front convinced Hitler, Himmler, and their inner circle that total extermination was not only possible but necessary. The gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor would later industrialize what the bullets had begun. For survivors, the devastation was beyond comprehension, as hundreds of thousands disappeared within months. The forests and ravines of Eastern Europe became open-air cemeteries, their soil still hiding the bones of countless victims. Operation Barbarossa, initially a military campaign, thus became the crucible in which the Holocaust transformed into a systematic continent-wide genocide. The invasion of the Soviet Union was not only a turning point in the war, but also in human history, a descent into brutality on a scale the world had never witnessed. It was here, on the blood-soaked soil of the East, that the full horror of the Holocaust first took shape. On January 20th, 1942, in a quiet lakeside villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, a meeting of 15 high-ranking Nazi officials took place that would forever shape the trajectory of human history. The villa, elegant and serene, stood in stark contrast to the horrors being discussed inside its polished walls. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, and one of Heinrich Himmler's most trusted lieutenants, chaired the meeting with clinical efficiency. The agenda was not military strategy or foreign policy, but the logistical coordination of genocide. By this time, the mass shootings in the Soviet Union had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, but the Nazi leadership sought a more organized and less psychologically burdensome method of extermination. The conference's purpose was to formalize what they termed the final solution of the Jewish question. This phrase, deceptively bureaucratic, masked the reality of annihilating every Jew within reach of German power. Representatives from various ministries, including the Interior, Justice, and the Foreign Office, gathered not to debate morality, but to refine methods. Heydrich presented statistics on the Jewish population across Europe, treating millions of human beings as entries in a ledger. In less than 2 hours, the machinery of genocide was given its cold bureaucratic approval. The context of the conference is essential to understand its significance. By early 1942, Nazi Germany was at the height of its territorial power, having conquered much of Europe and invaded deep into the Soviet Union. Ghettos were overflowing, shootings by the Einsatzgruppen were ongoing, and the question before the regime was how to manage the Jewish problem on a continental scale. The decision to exterminate was not born at Wannsee. It had been developing since the invasion of the East, but the conference provided the coordination and consensus needed for systematic implementation. The participants were not fanatical SS men alone, but included educated civil servants, lawyers, and diplomats. This blend of ideology and bureaucracy revealed how ordinary institutions became complicit in extraordinary crimes. The genocide required railways to transport victims, legal decrees to strip rights, financial offices to seize property, and ministries to coordinate between occupied territories. 1C demonstrated that extermination was not a fringe project, but state policy endorsed across government branches. The presence of men with doctorates and legal training underscored how genocide was cloaked in the language of procedure and order. The meeting's calm atmosphere belied the radicality of its outcome. Reinhard Heydrich opened the meeting with a summary of Nazi policies toward Jews since 1933, framing the discussion as a matter of policy evolution rather than moral rupture. He noted that emigration, once promoted as a solution, was no longer viable due to the war and the sheer numbers involved. Deportation to the east had already begun, but this alone could not achieve the scale of destruction envisioned by the Nazi leadership. Heydrich then outlined a plan for the physical extermination of 11 million Jews across Europe, including those in neutral and even allied countries. His speech transformed human lives into numerical problems requiring solutions. The participants listened without protest, nodding in agreement, and occasionally raising questions of jurisdiction rather than principle. Adolf Eichmann, Heydrich's subordinate, took meticulous minutes, later recalling that the tone was disturbingly businesslike, as if they were discussing administrative reforms. No one raised objections to killing millions. Instead, they debated categories such as mixed marriages and partial Jewish ancestry. The discussion made clear that genocide would be carried out with legalistic precision, ensuring no loophole allowed survival. By the end, extermination had been presented as policy, not atrocity. The language of the 1C Protocol, the document summarizing the meeting, was deliberately euphemistic. Words like evacuation, treatment, and special handling were used to conceal the reality of murder. This coded language reflected both the need for secrecy and the desire to normalize genocide within bureaucratic structures. The protocol listed Jewish populations across Europe in a matter-of-fact table, with numbers assigned to each country as if counting commodities. France 865,000, the Netherlands 160,800, Poland, under general government administration, over 2 million, the Soviet Union 5 million. Each figure represented communities with synagogues, schools, families, and traditions, all reduced to a line in a chart. The cold detachment of the document illustrates how mass murder was stripped of human reality. For the men at 1C, the project of annihilation became a logistical challenge rather than a moral crime. This bureaucratic disguise enabled participants to distance themselves from the bloodshed while fully consenting to its implementation. The conference also addressed complex categories of identity, reflecting the Nazi obsession with racial classification. Officials debated how to handle Mischlinge, or mixed-race individuals of partial Jewish ancestry. Should they be sterilized, deported, or allowed temporary exemption? Some argued for case-by-case evaluations, while others pushed for blanket policies. The very fact that such debates occurred underscores the chilling precision with which the Nazis sought to eradicate ambiguity. Marriage between Jews and non-Jews was also discussed, with proposals for forced dissolution or harsher penalties. These deliberations were not acts of hesitation but of refinement, ensuring that no loophole could undermine the totality of extermination. The obsession with racial purity extended to every corner of life, from family units to legal categories. Ultimately, the conference concluded that half measures were inadequate, The machinery of genocide must leave no one untouched. This meticulous approach revealed the depth of Nazi determination to pursue their vision of racial annihilation. Adolf Eichmann later reflected on the atmosphere of the meeting, describing it as one of consensus rather than debate. According to his testimony years later, the participants spoke with great frankness, shielded by the assumption of secrecy. He recalled that some officials even made crude jokes, treating genocide as an administrative convenience. For Eichmann, the meeting confirmed his role as the logistical coordinator of mass deportations, a responsibility he would embrace with chilling dedication. He arranged train schedules, liaised with rail authorities, and ensured that transports to extermination camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka ran with precision. Wannsee gave him and others the authorization to proceed without hesitation. What was decided in a 2-hour meeting required years of implementation, carried out with ruthless efficiency. The ordinary bureaucratic setting, with coffee and cognac served, reinforced how genocide was embedded in the routine functions of governance. The men left the villa not with horror but with clarity of purpose. For them, Wannsee was not an anomaly but a natural extension of Nazi policy. The secrecy of the Wannsee Conference was maintained during the war, with only a handful of copies of the protocol distributed. Most were destroyed to prevent incrimination, but one survived in German archives, discovered after the war by Allied investigators. This single document provided crucial evidence at the Nuremberg Trials, exposing the premeditated nature of the final solution. The surviving copy demonstrated how genocide had been discussed calmly, planned methodically, and approved at the highest levels of state. For prosecutors, it was proof that extermination was not the result of battlefield chaos, but a deliberate policy. The chilling clarity of the protocol made it one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Nazi leaders. Historians continue to regard it as the moment when the Holocaust shifted from scattered atrocities to a centrally coordinated program. Without Wannsee, the genocide might have lacked the bureaucratic coherence that made it so devastatingly efficient. The villa on the lake became a symbol of how civilization's institutions can be weaponized for destruction. In retrospect, the Wannsee Conference was not a long or dramatic gathering, but its consequences were catastrophic. In less than 2 hours, men with pens and papers outlined the destruction of an entire people. They drank, they joked, and they spoke in euphemisms, yet the reality behind their words was the death of millions. The meeting illustrated the banality of evil, the way ordinary administrative processes can enable extraordinary crimes. It showed that genocide did not require fiery speeches or open brutality in every moment. It required calm planning, coordination, and collective consent. Wannsee symbolized how the Holocaust was not just carried out by fanatics with guns, but by educated men in suits who saw murder as policy. After January 1942, the killing escalated with new intensity as extermination camps began their deadly work. The final solution had been transformed into state-sanctioned continent-wide genocide, and in a villa overlooking a frozen lake, the Holocaust entered its most devastating phase. After the Wannsee Conference, the machinery of death shifted into motion with ruthless precision, turning plans into logistical realities. Deportations began on a vast scale, orchestrated with timetables, sealed orders, and chilling efficiency. Across occupied Europe, Jewish communities received sudden notices instructing them to prepare for resettlement in the East. These orders, couched in bureaucratic terms, gave little detail, but demanded families gather their belongings within hours or days. The illusion of resettlement was carefully maintained to minimize resistance, with promises of work opportunities or new homes awaiting them. People were told to bring only what they could carry, often limiting possessions to a small suitcase, blanket, or bundle. Those who obeyed were marched to railway stations under armed guard, stripped of dignity and choice. The trains that awaited them were not passenger cars but cattle wagons, designed for livestock, with no seats, windows, or sanitation. Men, women, and children were forced inside, crammed together until air became scarce. Thus began the systematic deportation of millions, a process that transformed Europe's railways into conduits of death. The trains themselves became symbols of despair, instruments of genocide, disguised as transportation. Each cattle car, often intended for no more than a dozen animals, was packed with 80 to 100 people. Once the doors slammed shut and were bolted from the outside, darkness engulfed the passengers. There was no water, no toilets, and only a bucket, if that, to serve as sanitation for days-long journeys. In summer, suffocating heat turned the wagons into ovens. In winter, freezing temperatures became lethal. Babies cried until their voices faded, and the elderly collapsed from exhaustion. Those who died en route were left to rot beside the living. Their bodies shifted only when guards opened the cars at their destination. For many, the journey itself became an early grave, killing thousands before they ever reached the camps. The sound of rattling wheels and iron locks became an omen of destruction across the continent. Europe's rail network, once built to connect cities and trade, had been commandeered to deliver human beings to annihilation. At the heart of these deportations stood Adolf Eichmann, the man tasked with coordinating transports across occupied Europe. From his office in Berlin, Eichmann arranged timetables with railway officials, ensuring that deportation trains ran alongside military convoys and freight without disrupting the war effort. He negotiated costs with the Reichsbahn, chillingly billing Jewish organizations to pay for their own deportation tickets. Every train became a calculated operation. The number of wagons, the departure time, the arrival schedule, and the precise capacity of human cargo. Eichmann's obsessive attention to detail turned genocide into a logistical puzzle, where efficiency was the measure of success. He reported to Himmler and Heydrich, boasting of his ability to solve problems of overcrowded ghettos and delayed transports. Eichmann never dirtied his hands with direct killing. Instead, his weapon was bureaucracy, wielded through ledgers, stamps, and signatures. He represented the banality of evil, showing how paperwork could fuel slaughter. The killing fields of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz depended on the timetables Eichmann meticulously maintained. Without his machinery of deportation, the Holocaust could not have unfolded with such terrifying scale and speed. For those herded onto trains, the ordeal was one of unimaginable terror, uncertainty, and despair. Families clung to each other as the wagons lurched forward, not knowing where the tracks would lead. Rumors spread. Some believed they were headed for labor camps. Others whispered of mass killings in forests, while many clung to denial, hoping survival lay ahead. Days dragged on in suffocating darkness, punctuated by cries, prayers, and the sound of fists pounding on locked wooden doors. Hunger gnawed at bodies, thirst cracked lips, and the stench of human waste filled the air. Mothers tried to soothe children with lullabies, though their voices trembled with fear. Some carved messages into the wooden walls, desperate to leave behind a final trace for the world to find. Others threw scraps of paper through cracks in the wagons, hoping passers-by would deliver their last words to loved ones. Every journey represented a community uprooted, its traditions, memories, and people crammed into a mobile coffin. When the doors finally opened, the nightmare was far from over. It was only beginning. The destinations of these trains were the extermination camps: Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. Each camp had been carefully chosen for its location along railway lines, ensuring smooth transfers of human cargo. Upon arrival, the newly deported were blinded by daylight, as guards barked orders and dogs snapped at their heels. Luggage was seized immediately, stacked into piles and sorted for plunder. Prisoners were divided into two lines, one for those deemed fit for labor, the other for women, children, the elderly, and the infirm. This selection determined life or death in seconds, based on a glance from an SS officer. The majority, often 70 to 80% of each transport, were sent directly to the gas chambers. The rest were marched to barracks, where starvation and forced labor would eventually claim them. Every train that arrived meant another community extinguished. For the Nazis, this process was industrial efficiency. For the victims, it was the shattering of human existence. The ghettos of Poland, once bursting with life despite oppression, became empty as deportation swept through them. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest in Europe, saw trains departing daily, carrying tens of thousands to Treblinka. Families were torn apart as roundups, known as Exclusion, filled the streets with chaos, screams, and the sound of boots pounding on cobblestones. Jews were dragged from hiding places, beaten and driven toward waiting trains, often in the dead of night. Resistance was minimal at first, as many still clung to the hope of survival through obedience. Smugglers, couriers, and underground groups tried to warn that deportation meant death, but disbelief often silenced their warnings. The scale was too enormous, the truth too horrific for many to accept. Within weeks, ghettos that had housed hundreds of thousands were reduced to ghostly ruins. Their inhabitants vanished into the abyss of extermination camps. The once vibrant Jewish quarters, filled with prayer, laughter, and commerce, now stood silent, haunted by absence. The trains had transformed living neighborhoods into empty shells of loss. The deportations were not limited to Poland. They swept across all of occupied Europe with terrifying reach. From France, convoys departed from Drancy, often filled with Jewish families arrested by French police, collaborating with the Nazis. In the Netherlands, transports left from Westerbork transit camp, sending Anne Frank and her family to Auschwitz. From Greece, Jews of Salonika, a community with centuries of history, were forced onto trains bound for Auschwitz, their journey lasting days across the continent. Hungary, Slovakia, Belgium, Italy, no corner of Europe remained untouched once the machinery was in full swing. Each occupied nation saw its own institutions, rail workers, police, clerks, become part of the process. Deportation required cooperation at every level, turning local complicity into global catastrophe. The trains rolled across borders with grim regularity, carrying with them not just victims, but the weight of centuries of culture and heritage. Each departure meant not just individuals lost, but entire histories erased. The Holocaust became continental in scope, carried forward on steel rails that crisscrossed Europe like veins of destruction. The deportations marked the Holocaust's transformation into a fully industrialized genocide. No longer were Jews killed only in forests or shot in pits by Einsatzgruppen. Now the apparatus of modern infrastructure carried millions to their deaths. The train, once a symbol of progress and connectivity, was perverted into a weapon of annihilation. The cattle car became as iconic as the gas chamber, both instruments in a system designed to erase a people. The sheer scale of deportation, millions moved in a matter of months, was unprecedented in history. It required planning, coordination, and complicity across societies, proving that genocide is not only the work of killers, but also of clerks, engineers, and conductors. Each whistle that signaled a train's departure echoed as a death knell across Europe. Each schedule stamped by an official became a sentence of annihilation. The The deportations were the veins through which the lifeblood of Jewish Europe was drained into the furnaces of extermination. And once the process began, it moved with unstoppable momentum, carrying millions toward their final destination. The Nazi regime established 6 extermination camps, whose sole purpose was industrialized murder: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. Unlike concentration camps, which combined imprisonment with forced labor, these sites were designed primarily for killing on an unprecedented scale. They were located in occupied Poland, chosen for both logistical and geographical reasons, lying at the intersection of Europe's railways and far from the German heartland. The camps were shrouded in secrecy, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and camouflage meant to conceal their function from outsiders. At their gates, deceptive signs promised labor or showers, maintaining the illusion of normalcy until the final moment. Once inside, prisoners faced selections, where most were dispatched immediately to gas chambers. The few spared were forced into labor to support the killing process itself, repairing infrastructure, sorting looted goods, or operating crematoria. Each camp developed its own method of extermination, but the underlying goal remained the same: mass death delivered with efficiency and precision. Trains delivered human cargo daily, unloading thousands who were processed in hours. The camps represented the culmination of Nazi racial ideology, the attempt to erase entire peoples through mechanized slaughter. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the most infamous of these death camps, both for its scale and its symbolic power. Built in stages, it combined a concentration camp, a labor camp, and an extermination facility into one vast complex. Its gas chambers and crematoria could kill and burn over 1 million souls, making it the deadliest single site of the Holocaust. Prisoners arriving at Auschwitz were confronted by the chilling words "Arbeit macht frei," work sets you free, a cruel deception masking the reality of extermination. The camp was divided into sections: Auschwitz I, the original base; Auschwitz II Birkenau, the killing center; and Auschwitz III Monowitz, a forced labor hub tied to German industry. Selections occurred immediately upon arrival. The young, elderly, and infirm were sent directly to death, while the able-bodied were temporarily spared. Inside the barracks, starvation, disease, and brutal labor ensured that survival was brief, even for those not gassed immediately. Auschwitz became a testing ground for techniques of mass murder, including the use of Zyklon B pellets, dropped into sealed chambers disguised as showers. The efficiency of this system turned Auschwitz into the ultimate embodiment of genocide. Survivors described it as a place where humanity itself seemed to have died. Treblinka, though smaller in size, achieved a horrifying efficiency in extermination unmatched by most camps. Constructed in 1942 as part of Operation Reinhard, it was designed solely for the killing of Jews deported from the Warsaw Ghetto and other regions. Unlike Auschwitz, there was no pretense of labor. Nearly all who arrived at Treblinka were dead within hours. Victims were marched down a narrow camouflaged path known as the Tube, leading directly from the train platform to the gas chambers. These chambers were disguised as bathhouses, complete with fake showerheads, to maintain the illusion until the doors were sealed. Carbon monoxide from engines was pumped into the chambers, suffocating victims in agony. The bodies were first buried in mass graves, then later exhumed and burned on open-air pyres to erase evidence of the crime. Treblinka claimed the lives of an estimated 800,000 to 900,000 Jews, making it one of the deadliest sites of the Holocaust, despite operating for just over a year. Survivor testimonies speak of the overwhelming stench of death and the speed at which entire transports were extinguished. It was a factory of killing, where life expectancy upon arrival was measured in hours, not days. Sobibor and Belzec, like Treblinka, were central to Operation Reinhard, designed exclusively for extermination. Belzec, the first of these camps, opened in March 1942 and became the testing ground for methods later perfected in other facilities. Its gas chambers, also disguised as showers, used carbon monoxide piped from engines, suffocating victims by the thousands each day. Belzec killed an estimated 500,000 Jews, nearly wiping out entire communities from southeastern Poland. Sobibor, meanwhile, operated with a similar system, claiming around 250,000 lives during its existence. Prisoners were stripped of possessions, herded naked into chambers, and gassed within hours of arrival. Few survived Sobibor, as it had no labor function. Only a small group of prisoners were temporarily spared to maintain camp operations. Both camps became models of ruthless efficiency, processing transports with mechanical regularity. Despite their horror, Sobibor later witnessed one of the rare successful uprisings, where prisoners staged a revolt and mass escape in October 1943. The fact that such camps existed solely to kill demonstrates the extreme radicalization of Nazi policy after Wannsee. Chelmno marked the earliest phase of extermination, beginning operations in December 1941, before the Reinhard camps were built. Situated near Ruoge, it introduced mobile gas vans as its primary killing method. Victims were told they were being transported for labor or resettlement, only to be sealed into the vans disguised as moving trucks. Exhaust fumes were redirected into the sealed compartments, suffocating those inside during short drives to nearby forests. The corpses were then unloaded and buried in pits, later exhumed and burned as the Nazis sought to conceal evidence. Chelmno killed an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 Jews, along with Romani people and Polish political prisoners. It operated with a small staff, relying on deception and speed to carry out extermination with minimal infrastructure. The simplicity of its killing method made it distinct, showing how murder could be carried out with little more than vehicles, fuel, and manpower. Chelmno served as a precursor to the larger extermination camps, proving that mass murder could be scaled up quickly. In many ways, it was the grim prototype of industrialized genocide. Majdanek differed from the Reinhard camps by combining extermination with forced labor on a large scale. Located near Lublin, it was initially established as a labor camp, but quickly evolved into a killing site. It featured multiple gas chambers, crematoria, and vast fields of barracks that housed prisoners in appalling conditions. Unlike more secretive camps, Majdanek's location near a major city made it visible to civilians, with smoke from its crematoria billowing into the skies of Lublin. It became a site of immense suffering for Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and Polish political detainees alike. Majdanek claimed at least 80,000 lives, many through gas chambers using Zyklon B, though starvation, disease, and brutal labor claimed countless more. The camp also became notorious for large-scale massacres, including the Harvest Festival in November 1943, when 18,000 Jews were shot in a single day. Prisoners arriving at Majdanek often saw the crematoria upon entry, a grim preview of their fate. Unlike some camps destroyed to erase evidence, Majdanek was captured largely intact by advancing Soviet forces in 1944. It remains today one of the most preserved monuments to Nazi mass murder. Each camp developed a system that resembled a production line of death, operating with ruthless regularity. Trains arrived daily, unloading thousands of people who were stripped, sorted, and sent to their fate. Gas chambers functioned like killing machines, designed to handle mass inflows of victims with mechanical precision. Crematoria worked around the clock, fueled by human remains, their chimneys releasing ash that settled on nearby towns like snow. Every detail was optimized for efficiency: the time required to fill chambers, the number of corpses that could be burned per day, the reuse of victims' belongings, clothes, shoes, eyeglasses, even hair and gold teeth were stripped, catalogued, and sent to Germany. What could not be exploited was reduced to ashes, scattered in fields, rivers, or forests. Guards were trained not to see individuals but numbers, processing human beings as though they were cargo. The killing process was designed to be impersonal, erasing empathy from those who carried it out. This mechanization of murder stands as one of the darkest achievements of modernity. The death camps transformed the Holocaust from persecution into annihilation, shifting from ghettos and shootings to industrial extermination. Each camp represented a machine of death, powered by railways, bureaucracy, and ideology. Survivors who lived to tell their stories described the camps as places where time stopped, where every day was measured in hunger, fear, and the shadow of death. For the millions who perished, their lives ended not in the chaos of battle, but in the cold calculation of extermination facilities. The Nazis perfected the art of killing to such an extent that it became routine, an everyday operation hidden behind barbed wire. In these camps, humanity was stripped away not only from the victims, but also from those who enforced the system. The death camps were not aberrations, but the logical conclusion of Nazi ideology carried to its extreme. They stood as monuments of cruelty, where the line between civilization and barbarism collapsed entirely. To walk through their ruins today is to confront the abyss of human possibility. In their silence, they continue to speak louder than any words could convey. Life inside the Nazi camps was a descent into a manufactured hell, designed to strip human beings of dignity, identity, and hope. Survivors recall the first moments upon arrival, when families were torn apart in the infamous selections. Men, women, and children were divided under the watchful eyes of SS officers, who with a flick of the wrist determined life or immediate death. Mothers screamed as children were wrenched from their arms, while fathers begged futilely for mercy, their voices drowned by barking dogs and shouted commands. The air was filled with confusion, disbelief, and terror, yet the process was executed with chilling efficiency. New arrivals were shaved, disinfected with burning chemicals, and forced into striped uniforms that erased individuality. Prisoners were no longer people but numbers, tattooed onto their arms as permanent reminders of their dehumanization. Shoes and clothing were stolen, possessions sorted into mountains that silently testified to mass theft. From the very beginning, camp life was structured to annihilate not just the body, but the spirit. In the eyes of the perpetrators, these captives had ceased to be human, reduced instead to expendable units in a system of destruction. The daily rhythm of life inside the camps revolved around endless labor and relentless suffering. Prisoners were awakened before dawn, often with blows from rifle butts or shouted orders that echoed through freezing barracks. Roll call could last for hours, forcing men and women to stand motionless in snow, rain, or blistering sun, as weak and starving bodies collapsed around them. Work assignments varied, but all were brutal, from back-breaking construction projects to carrying stones pointlessly from one pile to another and back again. Many labored in factories connected to German industry, where starvation diets and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Food rations were deliberately inadequate: a watery soup with traces of turnip, a thin slice of bread, perhaps a smear of margarine or sawdust sausage. Hunger gnawed constantly, driving many to trade scraps, lick bowls clean, or steal at great risk. Disease spread rapidly in overcrowded barracks, where lice, fleas, and filth turned minor ailments into death sentences. Sanitation was non-existent, with overflowing latrines and stagnant water sources, breeding epidemics of typhus and dysentery. Each day was a calculated assault on both body and soul. The destruction of family bonds was another deliberate cruelty within the camps. Entire families that had arrived together were systematically torn apart, with children often the first to be sent to gas chambers. Mothers lived in torment, haunted by the memory of their children's cries as they were led away, powerless to protect them. Fathers, too, were stripped of their role as protectors, reduced to silent laborers struggling merely to survive another day. For those who managed to stay with relatives, the bond became both a fragile comfort and a crushing burden. To watch a loved one suffer, starve, or die could break the will to endure, while simultaneously fueling the determination to survive in their memory. The Nazis understood the power of family and targeted it mercilessly, ensuring that even emotional ties became sources of pain. In barracks, whispers of lost children or missing spouses echoed at night, transforming the silence into a chorus of despair. The destruction of families was not incidental. It was central to the genocidal project. To eradicate a people, the Nazis dismantled the foundation of community, love, kinship, and continuity. Within the camps, loneliness was as lethal as hunger. The medical experiment represented one of the most sinister aspects of life inside the camps. Figures like Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz carried out grotesque experiments on twins, injecting them with chemicals, performing surgeries without anesthesia, and meticulously recording their suffering. Other prisoners were subjected to tests designed to simulate battlefield conditions, freezing them in ice water, infecting them with diseases, or mutilating them in the name of science. Women endured sterilization experiments, often leaving them permanently injured or dead. The victims were treated as disposable test subjects, their agony ignored or perversely documented. These experiments had no true scientific merit. They were driven by ideology, cruelty, and a macabre fascination with human suffering. Survivors who endured these torments carried scars, both physical and psychological, that haunted them long after liberation. Rumors of such experiments spread through the camps, amplifying fear and despair among prisoners. To live in constant knowledge that one might be summoned for medical procedures was a unique form of psychological torture. Within this realm, science was twisted into an instrument of dehumanization and death. Yet even amid such brutality, prisoners attempted to preserve fragments of humanity. Secretly, some continued to practice their faith, whispering prayers in the darkness or marking holidays with hidden rituals. In ghettos turned camps, Jewish traditions survived in whispers, songs, or smuggled scraps of sacred texts. Others clung to memory, reciting poems, stories, or songs that reminded them of life before captivity. Acts of solidarity became vital, sharing food, covering a sick comrade during roll call, or whispering encouragement during forced marches. These small gestures carried profound meaning, reminding prisoners that they were still human, still connected. The Nazis aimed to extinguish identity and culture, but defiance lived in the quiet insistence on dignity. Prisoners risked punishment or death to maintain these sparks of humanity, demonstrating resilience even in the darkest circumstances. Hope often took fragile forms: dreams of liberation, rumors of Allied advances, or the sheer refusal to surrender the will to live. The camps were machines of death, but within them the human spirit occasionally flickered against the overwhelming night. This resistance, however quiet, stood as a final testament to endurance. Starvation remained, one of the greatest killers within the camps. Daily rations amounted to slow execution, leaving prisoners skeletal, their bodies consumed by hunger. The obsession with food dominated every thought. Prisoners dreamed of bread, spoke endlessly of meals long past, and scavenged desperately for scraps. Some resorted to trading precious possessions, even pieces of clothing, for a crust of bread. Others picked through garbage heaps, seeking discarded peelings or bones. Starving men and women became unrecognizable, their skin stretched tightly over bones, eyes sunken and stomachs distended. Malnutrition weakened the immune system, ensuring that diseases like typhus or tuberculosis spread unchecked. Hunger also broke morale, turning friends against one another, as survival instincts overpowered solidarity. The Nazis understood this dynamic, weaponizing starvation as a tool of control and domination. To survive hunger was to fight daily against both death and despair. Discipline within the camps was enforced through terror and public punishment. The SS and Kapos, prisoners appointed as overseers, maintained order through beatings, humiliation, and executions. Roll calls often became spectacles of cruelty, where prisoners were hanged or shot before their peers as warnings. Minor infractions, such as stealing a potato or faltering at work, could result in savage punishment. Dogs were unleashed on prisoners, tearing them apart in scenes of orchestrated terror. Some were forced into standing cells, crammed into tiny concrete spaces, where they could neither sit nor lie down, often left for days. Others endured flogging, with beatings counted out to ensure maximum suffering. Collective punishment was common. Entire groups might be deprived of food or forced to stand in freezing cold because of one person's actions. These punishments aimed not only to kill, but to crush resistance and instill fear. In such an atmosphere, survival required not only endurance but the careful navigation of terror. Despite unimaginable suffering, survivor testimonies remind us that life inside the camps was not defined solely by death. It was also defined by endurance. Those who survived often credit a combination of luck, resilience, and human connection. Some were spared selection by chance, others managed to secure slightly less lethal work assignments. A kind word, a hidden crust of bread, or the simple companionship of another prisoner could mean the difference between despair and determination. Survivors recall holding on to memories of family, faith, or future dreams as anchors in a sea of brutality. They endured the sight of death, the stench of crematoria, and the sounds of endless suffering, yet somehow clung to the possibility of survival. The destruction of families, bodies, and spirits was nearly total, yet a core of humanity remained unextinguished. Their testimonies, carried forward after liberation, ensure that the world understands the depths of what occurred. Life inside the camps was meant to obliterate people entirely, but instead it left behind voices that continue to speak across generations. These voices are not just echoes of suffering, but enduring warnings of what humanity must never allow to happen again. Resistance during the Holocaust emerged in a world designed to crush the human spirit, and yet courage found ways to survive. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943 stands as the most iconic of these acts, when starving, outnumbered, and poorly armed Jews chose to fight rather than be led quietly to death. The ghetto had already been reduced to rubble by disease, hunger, and deportations, but rumors of Treblinka's extermination chambers gave survivors a terrible clarity: there would be no mercy. Young men and women, many from underground organizations like the Jewish fighting organization, Job, gathered weapons smuggled in through the city's sewers. Pistols, grenades, and a few rifles became tools of defiance in the hands of those long stripped of everything else. When German forces entered to liquidate the ghetto, they were met with fierce gunfire and homemade explosives from the ruins of burning buildings. Fighters emerged from bunkers, firing from windows and rooftops, forcing the occupiers into a battle they had not anticipated. For nearly a month, these outgunned resistors held off one of the most powerful armies in the world. Though the uprising ended in destruction, with the ghetto reduced to ashes, its defiance carried a power that transcended the battlefield. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising symbolized a refusal to surrender dignity, even in the shadow of certain death. The Warsaw fighters were driven by desperation, but also by an unshakable belief that resistance itself was victory. They understood that survival was unlikely, but to die fighting was to reclaim agency stolen by years of persecution. Fighters set fire to German tanks with bottles filled with gasoline, their flames reflecting the burning city around them. Hidden bunkers became strongholds, where families and combatants huddled together, waiting for the next German assault. Messages were smuggled out to the Polish resistance, appealing for help, though little aid reached them in time. Women played vital roles, carrying weapons, serving as couriers, and sometimes standing shoulder to shoulder in combat. Children, too, were messengers, darting through rubble-strewn alleys with notes that kept the fighters connected. As the battle stretched on, German forces responded with ruthless vengeance, leveling buildings block by block, sealing bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. Still, the fighters' resistance delayed deportations and demonstrated to the world that Jews were not passive victims. Their final stand became a beacon of defiance that echoed across occupied Europe. In the death camps, resistance took an even more astonishing form. At Sobibor in October 1943, prisoners orchestrated one of the most successful uprisings against the Nazi killing machine. Under the leadership of Alexander Pachersky, a Soviet Jewish prisoner of war, the plan involved killing SS officers one by one and seizing weapons before the alarm could spread. The prisoners worked with meticulous secrecy, luring guards into workshops where they were quietly stabbed or struck with axes. Once the signal was given, hundreds of inmates stormed the camp's gates, many running through barbed wire and minefields under a hail of bullets. Around 300 prisoners escaped, though many were later recaptured or killed, yet the uprising destroyed part of the camp's machinery of death. In retaliation, the Nazis closed Sobibor, erasing evidence of their crimes, but the revolt ensured that its memory could never be completely silenced. Survivors carried the story of defiance into the post-war world, giving testimony that the camps were not only places of death, but also of rebellion. Sobibor's revolt proved that even within the epicenter of extermination, human beings refused to submit completely. It was a victory of spirit, even when measured in lives lost. Treblinka, another extermination camp, witnessed a similar eruption of defiance in August 1943. By then, hundreds of thousands of Jews had already been murdered there, and prisoners knew their days were numbered. A secret committee of inmates, many forced to work in the camp's killing operations, plotted a desperate revolt. Using stolen keys and smuggled weapons, they coordinated a simultaneous attack on the guards, while setting the camp ablaze. Fires consumed barracks and fuel depots, black smoke rising like a signal of defiance over the killing grounds. Amid chaos, around 200 to 300 prisoners broke through the fences, though most were hunted down in the forests beyond. Still, dozens survived to bear witness, ensuring that the truth of Treblinka could never be erased. For those who fought, the revolt was both a rebellion and a final testimony, proof that even in the jaws of annihilation, resistance remained possible. German reprisals were swift and merciless, but the uprising dealt a symbolic blow to the illusion of total Nazi control. The flames of Treblinka's revolt illuminated one of history's darkest corners. Beyond the ghettos and camps, resistance flourished in the forests of Eastern Europe, where partisans waged guerrilla warfare against the occupiers. Many were Jews who had escaped deportation or fled from ghettos, finding refuge among trees and swamps that became both sanctuary and battlefield. Life in the forests was harsh, marked by hunger, cold, and constant danger. Yet these groups organized sabotage missions against German supply lines. They derailed trains carrying soldiers and equipment, attacked garrisons, and ambushed patrols. In Belarus, the Bielski partisans created not only a fighting force, but also a community, sheltering over 1,200 Jews in makeshift villages hidden deep in the woods. Armed with stolen rifles and improvised explosives, they proved that Jewish resistance was not confined to ghettos or camps, but extended into the very landscapes of occupied Europe. Their survival was itself resistance, preserving lives that the Nazis had marked for destruction. German forces conducted brutal anti-partisan operations, burning villages and massacring civilians in reprisal. Yet the persistence of partisan fighters demonstrated that even under relentless pressure, defiance endured. The forests became places where life and rebellion coexisted against impossible odds. Resistance also took spiritual and cultural forms, defying Nazi efforts to erase Jewish identity. In ghettos and camps, clandestine schools operated in basements, teaching children forbidden lessons of history, language, and faith. Rabbis led secret prayer gatherings, sometimes using scraps of paper as makeshift prayer books. Musicians played forbidden songs on smuggled instruments, their melodies carrying hope into air thick with despair. Diaries were written in hidden corners, recording the reality of oppression and preserving memory for future generations. These acts did not involve weapons or explosions, but they struck at the very heart of Nazi ideology, which sought not only to kill but to erase. To sing a song in Yiddish, to celebrate a holiday in secret, or to teach a child Hebrew was a declaration that culture and identity would not vanish. Even in Auschwitz, where death was constant, prisoners carved tiny tokens, told stories, and whispered prayers as acts of survival. Resistance here meant refusing to surrender the essence of being human. Though often unseen, these acts preserved dignity and defied annihilation. They too belong to the story of rebellion. The price of resistance was nearly always death, and yet people chose it over submission. German reprisals for uprisings were swift, brutal, and merciless. In the Warsaw Ghetto, when the uprising was crushed, thousands were executed or deported to Treblinka. At Sobibor and Treblinka, captured escapees were tortured and murdered, their suffering intended as warnings to others. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned to the ground, their populations slaughtered in acts of collective punishment. Yet these consequences did not erase the acts of defiance, but amplified their meaning. Resistance, even when crushed, left a scar on the Nazi illusion of invincibility. It reminded the world that even in the darkest night, courage can ignite a flame of hope. Survivors of revolts carried their memories into history, ensuring that the voices of the fallen would not be silenced. In defiance of annihilation, they proved that resistance was not futile, but eternal. The story of resistance during the Holocaust is not one of military victory, but of moral triumph. Against an enemy armed with overwhelming power, Jews and other victims of Nazi tyranny chose to fight, to sabotage, to teach, to pray, and to survive. Their actions shattered the myth that they went like sheep to the slaughter, proving instead that defiance burned fiercely in the face of terror. From the rubble of Warsaw to the flames of Treblinka, from the forests of Belarus to the secret classrooms of ghettos, rebellion took countless forms. Each act, however small, represented a refusal to let the Nazis dictate the meaning of life and death. These uprisings and acts of defiance echoed long after the war, inspiring generations to remember that courage can exist even when hope seems extinguished. They remind us that resistance is not always measured in victories won, but in dignity preserved. The fighters of Warsaw, Sobibor, Treblinka, and the partisans in the forests wrote a chapter of history with their sacrifice. Their legacy is a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the face of annihilation, they chose defiance, and in doing so they became eternal symbols of resistance. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 16, the final months of the Holocaust? Death marches, collapsing camps, intensification of killings, desperation of the SS, and the suffering of prisoners up until liberation in the same 8x10 format. You said, as the machinery of extermination consumed millions across Europe, the world outside Nazi-occupied lands grappled with rumors, fragmented reports, and the difficulty of belief. News of massacres filtered out through diplomats, refugees, and underground resistance groups, carried across borders in coded messages and whispered testimonies. In 1942, Polish couriers like Jan Karski risked their lives to travel into ghettos and camps, gathering evidence of atrocities that defied imagination. They brought their findings to London and Washington, pleading for action, but often met skepticism or disbelief. Governments and populations alike struggled to grasp the scale of what was unfolding, unable to conceive of industrialized genocide. Newspapers carried stories, sometimes buried on inner pages, framing them as unconfirmed or exaggerated. The Nazis themselves encouraged this disbelief, cloaking their crimes in euphemisms and secrecy. For those inside occupied Europe, the truth was undeniable, but for those far removed, the horror often seemed abstract. By the time confirmations reached Allied leaders, millions had already perished. The world's slow reaction remains one of the most haunting questions of the Holocaust. The Allies possessed intelligence about Nazi atrocities earlier than many realize, yet their responses were muted and hesitant. British intelligence decrypted German communications through the Enigma machine, intercepting reports from Einsatzgruppen units detailing mass shootings in the Soviet Union. These chilling dispatches described tens of thousands murdered in single operations, their bodies buried in ravines and fields. Yet the information was kept largely secret, classified under wartime security, with few details made public. Officials feared undermining morale or diluting focus on the larger war effort. The United States, meanwhile, received testimonies from Jewish leaders and diplomats, including the Regner Telegram of 1942, which described Hitler's plan to annihilate European Jewry. Even with such evidence, bureaucrats and politicians debated the credibility of these reports. Some dismissed them as wartime propaganda, recalling exaggerated stories from World War I. Others accepted them privately, but failed to act decisively. The result was a silence that allowed the killing to continue unchecked. Refugees themselves became the most compelling voices, carrying their stories across borders in desperate bids for recognition. Survivors who managed to escape occupied Poland or Germany recounted tales of ghettos emptied, trains packed with deportees, and forests echoing with gunfire. Yet their accounts were often met with doubt, as the scale of slaughter seemed beyond comprehension. In London, Jewish leaders begged Winston Churchill's government to make a public stand, but officials prioritized military strategy. In Washington, similar appeals reached Franklin Roosevelt, but the United States remained cautious, its immigration quotas strict and its political climate tinged with antisemitism. Even when proof accumulated, Allied leaders feared that diverting resources to humanitarian rescue would weaken the fight against Germany itself. As refugees pleaded, many were told that victory in the war was the only path to liberation. Yet with every day lost, more lives vanished into camps and killing fields. The gap between knowledge and action grew wider. For many, the silence of the free world compounded the cruelty of Nazi crimes. Jewish organizations across the globe, particularly in the United States, struggled to mobilize awareness and pressure governments into action. Protests, rallies, and petitions were organized, with leaders demanding bombings of rail lines to Auschwitz or public condemnations of Nazi crimes. The famous Rabbi Stephen Wise revealed details of the genocide to the press in late 1942, sparking both outrage and disbelief. Demonstrations were held in New York, drawing attention to the catastrophe, yet political inertia persisted. The Bermuda Conference of 1943, convened by the Allies to address the refugee crisis, ended in disappointment, offering little more than vague promises. Immigration quotas remained untouched, leaving countless Jews trapped in Europe with no path to escape. Frustration grew within Jewish communities, who saw inaction as complicity. Leaders questioned whether their voices were truly being heard in corridors of power. Meanwhile, propaganda campaigns framed the war as one against tyranny, but rarely emphasized the Jewish plight directly. The urgency of saving lives was too often overshadowed by geopolitical priorities. The Vatican, too, faced criticism for its ambiguous role during these years of mass murder. Pope Pius XII received extensive reports from bishops and priests across Europe, many of whom witnessed deportations and killings firsthand. Yet his public statements remained restrained, condemning violence in general terms, without naming Jews as the primary victims. Defenders argue that the Vatican sought to avoid Nazi retaliation against Catholics, or feared losing influence in occupied territories. Critics counter that silence in the face of genocide amounted to moral failure. In private, the Church offered aid to some Jewish refugees, hiding them in monasteries and convents across Italy and elsewhere. Still, the absence of a forceful public denunciation left many wondering what might have changed had the Pope spoken with clarity. The Vatican's diplomacy maintained neutrality, emphasizing prayer and quiet assistance. But history continues to question whether neutrality was possible in the face of industrial extermination. The debate over moral responsibility remains unresolved. Neutral nations like Switzerland, Sweden, and Turkey found themselves in complex positions, balancing diplomacy, trade, and morality. Switzerland, a haven for refugees, simultaneously turned many away at its borders, citing fears of being overwhelmed. Sweden, while initially cautious, later emerged as a beacon of rescue through figures like Raoul Wallenberg, who saved thousands of Hungarian Jews with protective passports. Turkey acted as a conduit for information, with diplomats in Istanbul relaying reports of genocide to Allied capitals. Some individuals, like the Portuguese diplomat Aristides de Sousa Mendes, defied orders and issued visas that saved lives. Yet such heroism was often the exception rather than the rule, with governments prioritizing national interests over humanitarian impulses. The plight of the Jews remained entangled in larger calculations of war and politics. Neutral states calculated risks and often chose caution. Still, within these countries, individuals made choices that demonstrated the power of moral courage. Their actions stand out against the backdrop of widespread hesitation. By 1944, when aerial reconnaissance revealed Auschwitz and its sprawling network of barracks and crematoria, the debate over intervention reached its peak. Requests poured in to bomb the camp's gas chambers or the rail lines feeding it, but military leaders argued that resources had to remain focused on defeating the German army. The Allies maintained that only total victory could halt the killing, dismissing targeted operations as impractical. Critics have since questioned this reasoning, pointing out that the same bombers that struck oil refineries near Auschwitz could have easily hit the death camp's infrastructure. Survivors later recalled watching Allied planes fly overhead, knowing help was so close yet never arriving. The refusal to bomb Auschwitz remains one of the most controversial decisions of the war. For those trapped inside, the skies symbolized both hope and abandonment. The Allies' strategy prioritized long-term victory, but the cost was millions who might have been saved. Inaction in these critical months left a wound that history still reckons with. The question lingers, what could have been done differently? The world's response to the Holocaust remains one of its most troubling legacies. Knowledge was present, courage existed, but decisive action was often absent, constrained by disbelief, bureaucracy, and political calculation. For the victims, the silence of the outside world deepened their isolation, confirming the sense that they had been abandoned. Yet amidst the failure of nations, individuals shone as beacons, couriers, diplomats, partisans, and rescuers who risked everything to save even one life. Their courage stands in stark contrast to the inertia of governments. The Holocaust revealed not only the depths of human cruelty, but also the consequences of global hesitation. In its aftermath, the cry of never again became a vow not only against genocide, but against the failure to act in the face of it. The moral weight of inaction has haunted generations, shaping international law and human rights movements. It forces us to ask not only what the Nazis did, but what the world allowed to happen. In the silence of the powerful, millions were lost, and their absence is a reminder of the cost of waiting too long. By the final months of the war, as Allied forces pressed in from both east and west, the Nazi regime sought desperately to erase the evidence of their crimes. Camps that had stood as centers of industrialized murder were now being dismantled, their prisoners forced onto the roads in massive columns. These evacuations, known as the death marches, were not orderly transfers but calculated ordeals of suffering. Guards armed with rifles and whips pushed men, women, and children into the winter snow. Prisoners were given almost no food, no water, and no rest, compelled to march for dozens of miles each day. The sick, the elderly, and the weak fell behind quickly, collapsing in the frozen mud. Shots echoed regularly as SS men executed those who could no longer continue. Others froze silently, their bodies stiffening where they lay as the columns pressed forward. The sound of boots on ice mixed with moans and cries, creating an atmosphere of dread. Survival was reduced to endurance in the face of cold, hunger, and cruelty. The first major evacuations began in January 1945, when Soviet armies approached Auschwitz, the largest and most notorious of the Nazi camps. Roughly 56,000 prisoners were driven out in blizzard conditions, marching westward toward camps in Germany. Columns of skeletal figures stretched across frozen landscapes, their striped uniforms barely shielding them from sub-zero winds. Along the way, villagers watched in silence, some terrified, others indifferent, a few daring to slip a crust of bread to the starving marchers. The journey was brutal. Dozens collapsed every hour, their corpses lining the roadside. Guards shouted commands in barking German, occasionally unleashing dogs to terrorize the weak. Prisoners who tried to escape into forests or fields were hunted down and shot within sight of their companions. Train transport was no safer. Cattle cars, when available, were packed so tightly that many suffocated before arrival. By the time survivors reached camps like Dachau and Bergen-Belsen, they were little more than shadows. This march from Auschwitz became a grim symbol of the Nazis' final cruelty. The marches were not limited to Auschwitz alone. They spread across the collapsing Reich. Prisoners from camps in Poland, the Baltic states, and eastern Germany were forced toward central German territories. In some cases, columns stretched for days along rural roads, guarded by heavily armed SS units. Local residents were ordered to ignore the processions, though some secretly left buckets of water or loaves of bread at crossroads. The prisoners' feet often bled through makeshift shoes, leaving crimson stains on the snow and dirt. Dysentery and exhaustion swept through the groups, further weakening them. Guards offered no mercy. Those who stumbled too often were executed without hesitation. Villages awoke to the sound of gunfire as prisoners were killed in ditches or barns when they could walk no farther. The marches, meant to conceal evidence of genocide, became mass killings in themselves. The journey westward was every bit as deadly as the camps left behind. Eyewitnesses, both survivors and civilians, later described the inhumanity of these forced marches. Survivors spoke of hallucinations brought on by starvation, of snowflakes mistaken for food, and of dreams of water that never came. The living often walked past the bodies of friends or relatives, too weak to carry or even mourn them. Mothers tried to shield children from guards' blows, only to be struck themselves. Columns of marchers shuffled in near silence, broken only by the occasional shot or the wail of a child. Civilians peering from shuttered windows sometimes whispered prayers but rarely acted. Fear of Nazi retribution silenced many, even as they witnessed columns of human misery passing their doors. Guards displayed cruelty not only through violence, but also through mockery, laughing at the starving captives. To the prisoners, each hour felt like an eternity, each step a struggle against collapse. Death was constant, immediate, and merciless. Winter cold magnified the suffering, with temperatures plunging well below freezing in January 1945. Prisoners wrapped themselves in rags, stolen blankets, or scraps of straw to shield against the icy winds. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and entire limbs, leaving survivors crippled long after liberation. Snow mixed with blood as columns trudged across frozen rivers and barren fields. At night, prisoners huddled together in barns or roadside ditches, their breath forming icy clouds in the dark. Sleep offered no escape. Guards frequently woke them with blows or rifle butts. Fires were rarely allowed, and food was scarce, often a single crust shared among many. Some prisoners resorted to eating grass or bark, desperate for any sustenance. Others whispered prayers, clinging to hope that liberation might come before death. The elements themselves became another executioner, alongside bullets and starvation. Among the most infamous of these marches was the evacuation from Stuttgart, a camp near the Baltic Sea. In January 1945, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced out as Soviet forces approached. Columns trudged across icy landscapes toward Lauenburg, enduring temperatures so low that entire groups froze to death overnight. Survivors later recalled corpses stacked like firewood along the route, abandoned as the column pressed forward. Those who stumbled were clubbed or shot, their bodies left behind in snowbanks. Villagers encountered columns that looked less like humans and more like moving skeletons. The stench of unwashed bodies and rotting wounds lingered in the cold air. Children, the elderly, and the sick perished first, unable to withstand the pace of those who began the march. Only a fraction survived the journey. Stuttgart's march became a harrowing emblem of the Nazis' final atrocities. Usually, the chaos of the Nazi retreat meant that some prisoners were marched aimlessly, with no clear destination. Commanders shifted routes constantly, trying to avoid advancing Allied armies. Prisoners wandered in circles through forests, villages, and backroads, their ordeal stretching for weeks. Food supplies dwindled to nothing, leaving many to die of hunger in ditches. In some cases, columns arrived at camps already overcrowded and disease-ridden, where death continued. Guards themselves grew desperate, but their brutality never diminished, taking out their frustration on the defenseless. Survivors recalled the despair of walking without purpose, unsure whether they would live another hour. Desperation drove some to collapse willingly, accepting death as a release from torment. Others clung fiercely to life, determined to witness liberation no matter the cost. The marches became a theater of chaos, cruelty, and pointless suffering. By spring 1945, when Allied troops finally began liberating camps, they also encountered columns of prisoners still on the move. American, British, and Soviet soldiers stumbled upon groups staggering through forests and along highways, half dead from exhaustion. The soldiers were stunned by the sight, living skeletons wrapped in rags, some too weak to even look up. Liberation came suddenly, but for many it was too late, as countless prisoners collapsed moments after being freed. Survivors remembered the kindness of soldiers who shared rations, water, and blankets with them. Yet they also recalled the bodies scattered along the roadside, silent witnesses to the suffering endured. The death marches, intended by the Nazis to conceal their crimes, instead exposed them more starkly than ever. They revealed the full cruelty of a regime that sought destruction even in defeat. For the victims, survival was both a miracle and a burden, haunted by memories of those left behind. The death marches became one of the Holocaust's final and most haunting chapters. In January 1945, the Red Army pushed westward into Poland, smashing through the defences of the retreating Wehrmacht. On January 27th, they reached the gates of Auschwitz, the largest and most infamous of all Nazi camps. What they found stunned even hardened soldiers who had seen years of war, endless barracks filled with skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, and warehouses crammed with human belongings. Around 7,000 prisoners were still alive, most too weak to walk, their bodies ravaged by starvation and disease. Liberation came as both salvation and shock, for the survivors were barely able to comprehend freedom. Soviet soldiers distributed food and water, though some prisoners, unable to digest after such deprivation, died from overeating. The sheer scale of Auschwitz's machinery of death was revealed in the abandoned crematoria, the empty canisters of Zyklon B, and mountains of hair, shoes, and eyeglasses. Soldiers walked through the ruins in silence, the air heavy with the stench of burning flesh. For the first time, the world began to glimpse the enormity of Nazi crimes. Auschwitz's liberation became an enduring symbol of both horror and survival. As Soviet forces continued westward, they liberated camps across Poland and eastern Germany, each revealing horrors that defied imagination. At Majdanek near Lublin, captured almost intact in July 1944, soldiers discovered functioning gas chambers, crematoria, and tens of thousands of shoes taken from murdered victims. The Germans had attempted to destroy evidence but fled too quickly, leaving behind everything. Soviet journalists and foreign correspondents were invited to witness the sight, producing the first public images of Nazi death camps. Survivors staggered out of barracks too frail to even stand, clutching blankets or leaning on each other. Children with shaved heads and hollow eyes were carried by nurses, while medics tried to nurse the dying back to health. Bodies lay unburied in pits, evidence of killings conducted until the last moment. For the liberators, battle-hardened men who had crossed rivers of blood, these camps represented something different, calculated, industrial cruelty on an unimaginable scale. Even amidst the devastation of total war, the Holocaust stood apart. Majdanek became a grim foreshadowing of what the world would soon learn in full. In April 1945, British troops advancing through northern Germany reached the camp of Bergen-Belsen. What they encountered surpassed even their worst expectations. More than 60,000 prisoners living among 13,000 unburied corpses. The stench of disease and death hung thick in the air, so overwhelming that soldiers gagged as they entered. Survivors were covered in sores, their skeletal bodies too weak to stand, many lying motionless on the ground. Typhus, dysentery, and starvation spread uncontrollably, creating an apocalyptic scene. Medical units worked desperately, but hundreds died every day. Even after liberation, bulldozers were eventually brought in to push piles of corpses into mass graves, a chilling necessity in the face of overwhelming death. British officers, hardened by years of combat, broke down in tears at what they saw. Photographers and journalists documented everything, ensuring that the world could not look away. Bergen-Belsen's liberation revealed not only Nazi brutality, but also the human body's breaking point under systematic neglect. American forces advancing into Bavaria discovered Dachau on April 29, 1945, the oldest concentration camp in the Nazi system. Established in 1933, it had evolved into a model of terror, housing political prisoners, Jews, clergy, and resistance fighters. Soldiers arrived. They found more than 30,000 survivors in unimaginable conditions, emaciated and covered in lice. Boxcars on the railway siding contained hundreds of corpses, left in heaps from recent evacuations. Prisoners too weak to stand crawled forward, kissing the boots of soldiers who entered the gates. Shock and rage overwhelmed many American troops, some of whom executed captured SS guards on the spot. Photographers recorded every detail: the crematoria, the barracks, the piles of skeletal dead stacked like firewood. Dachau's liberation demonstrated the full brutality of the Nazi system in Germany's own heartland. Survivors, some unable to believe the ordeal was truly over, wept as they embraced their liberators. The camp became a symbol of justice, reclaimed on German soil. Liberation was not a single event, but a wave that swept across Europe in 1944 and 1945. Each camp revealed new layers of horror, from the slave laborers at Buchenwald to the medical experiments uncovered at Ravensbrück. In some cases, prisoners had already revolted or fled before Allied troops arrived, leaving only smoldering ruins. In others, guards had fled, abandoning thousands of starving captives to their fate. Soldiers often described entering camps as stepping into another world, one that felt separate even from the battlefields of Europe. The dead far outnumbered the living, and the smell of decay was everywhere. Liberation carried joy, but also unbearable grief, as survivors realized how many family members were gone. Soldiers who had stormed beaches and crossed rivers admitted they had never seen such desolation. The shock traveled quickly back home through photographs and newsreels. The truth of the Holocaust began to pierce global consciousness in those days of liberation. For survivors, liberation was both deliverance and the beginning of another struggle. Many were too weak to process what freedom meant, their bodies unable to recover from years of starvation and disease. Hospitals were overwhelmed as Allied doctors tried experimental treatments, with mixed success. Some survivors died within hours of rescue, their systems unable to handle even small amounts of food. Others, barely clinging to life, slowly regained strength under medical care. Psychological wounds were harder to heal. Nightmares and trauma haunted survivors long after. Children searched desperately for parents who would never return. Liberators often described the most haunting part not as the corpses but the hollow stares of those who lived. In the silence after liberation, the absence of millions became painfully clear. Survival did not erase suffering, but it allowed testimony to endure. The liberators themselves were changed forever by what they saw. Soviet, British, and American soldiers carried memories of camps into their post-war lives, often speaking of them with tears decades later. Journalists who documented the scenes produced reports that shocked the global public. Film reels captured by Allied cameramen were shown in movie theaters, confronting ordinary citizens with undeniable images. Military leaders, including Eisenhower, insisted on documenting everything to prevent denial in the future. The horrors became evidence in the Nuremberg Trials, where photographs, films, and testimonies were used to convict Nazi leaders. Soldiers wrote home to families describing sights they struggled to put into words. Chaplains prayed over mass graves, acknowledging the suffering of countless unnamed victims. Liberation was a victory, but it was also a revelation that victory had come too late for millions. The memory of that first encounter with pure evil marked an entire generation of liberators. August. By May 1945, the camps stood open to the world, their gates no longer guarded by SS men, but by Allied soldiers. Liberation revealed the full machinery of genocide. The barracks, the crematoria, the piles of belongings stripped from the murdered. Survivors stood as living proof, fragile yet unbroken, their testimonies soon to shape global understanding. The war in Europe ended, but the scars of the camps would never fade. Liberation was not only the end of imprisonment, it was the beginning of remembrance. From Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau to Buchenwald, the moment of freedom carried both relief and unbearable sorrow. The silence of those who could not be saved hung over every celebration. In the months that followed, survivors began the painful process of rebuilding lives from ashes. Liberation became the first chapter of a long journey toward justice, memory, and the vow of never again. The guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, but for millions who had lived through the Holocaust, peace did not erase the devastation. Survivors emerged from the camps broken in body and spirit, often discovering that their families, homes, and entire communities no longer existed. Jewish towns across Poland, Ukraine, Hungary, and Germany were now empty shells, their populations annihilated. Many survivors wandered back to their birthplaces, only to find strangers living in their houses and neighbors unwilling to welcome them back. Acts of antisemitism continued even after the war, with pogroms erupting in parts of Poland, driving Jews once again into fear. The world had been freed from Nazi tyranny, but survivors were left in a wilderness of grief and dislocation. In Allied zones of occupation, camps once used for imprisonment were now repurposed as shelters for displaced persons. Here survivors slept in barracks, waiting for news of family or for permission to emigrate. For many, these camps became way stations between horror and hope. The aftermath of liberation was not a swift return to normal life, but the beginning of another long struggle for dignity. The question of justice loomed large as Allied leaders confronted the enormity of Nazi crimes. The Nuremberg Trials, convened in November 1945, brought leading Nazi officials before an international tribunal. 24 of Hitler's closest allies, including Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Wilhelm Keitel, sat in the dock. For the first time in history, crimes against humanity were defined and prosecuted on a global stage. Courtrooms filled with evidence gathered from the liberated camps, films, photographs, witness testimony, and even the words of the perpetrators themselves. Survivors took the stand, recounting their experiences with harrowing detail that transfixed the world. Göring, defiant to the end, clashed with prosecutors, while others insisted they had only followed orders. The proceedings were broadcast globally, forcing ordinary citizens to confront the depths of Nazi cruelty. Justice, though imperfect, was being attempted on a scale never before seen. Nuremberg became both a reckoning and a warning for future generations. Says Peer. Inside the courtroom, evidence of the Holocaust was laid bare with precision and clarity. Allied prosecutors presented thousands of documents, orders signed by Nazi officials, and meticulous records kept by the SS. Films shot by Allied troops in camps like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau were played to a hushed chamber, showing images so shocking that even hardened military men wept. Survivors like Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier described starvation, beatings, and gas chambers with haunting calm. The German public, who had been shielded from much of the truth, now saw the reality of what had been carried out in their name. Arguments of ignorance crumbled under the weight of evidence. The concept of following orders was challenged, establishing the principle of personal responsibility in international law. Journalists from around the world reported daily, their words echoing across continents. The trial was not only about punishing the guilty, but about establishing an irrefutable record. In doing so, it created a legal framework that would influence human rights law for decades. Sentences at Nuremberg varied, but the symbolic weight was immense. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death, including Ribbentrop, Keitel, and Göring, though Göring cheated the hangman by committing suicide the night before his execution. Others received long prison terms, while some escaped justice due to insufficient evidence. Beyond the individuals punished, the trial sent a clear message: the world would no longer tolerate crimes of such magnitude going unpunished. Yet many survivors felt justice was incomplete, for countless perpetrators evaded trial, slipping into obscurity or hiding in new identities. Still, Nuremberg marked a profound shift in moral accountability. For the first time, leaders were judged not just by the victors of war, but by humanity as a whole. The trial's legacy echoed beyond its verdicts, establishing that genocide and systemic atrocities could not be dismissed as acts of war. It was the beginning of an international conscience. Even as sentences were carried out, the shadow of loss lingered, for no verdict could bring back the millions murdered. While courts pursued justice, survivors faced the painful task of rebuilding lives. Displaced persons camps across Germany, Austria, and Italy became temporary homes for hundreds of thousands of Jews with nowhere to go. These camps were overcrowded and under-resourced, but within them a fragile sense of community began to re-emerge. Schools were opened, cultural programs revived, and newspapers printed as survivors sought to reclaim their stolen identity. Rabbis performed weddings and children were born, symbols of defiance against extermination. Yet the trauma was never far away. Many survivors could not sleep without nightmares of the camps. Letters circulated desperately, seeking news of missing family, though most never returned. Aid organizations, including the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, worked tirelessly to provide food and medical care. But above all, survivors longed for a permanent home where they could live free from persecution. For many, this longing turned their eyes toward Palestine, and later the emerging state of Israel. Emigration became both hope and necessity for countless survivors. The United States, Britain, and other allied nations gradually loosened immigration restrictions, allowing some to start new lives abroad. In Palestine, tens of thousands of Holocaust survivors arrived despite British limits, joining the struggle that would eventually lead to the birth of Israel in 1948. For those who settled in America, Canada, or Australia, the challenge was to assimilate while carrying the weight of memory. Survivors built businesses, raised families, and tried to create normalcy after years of chaos. Many spoke little of their past, burying memories too painful to share, while others testified publicly, determined the world would never forget. Communities formed around synagogues and cultural centers, carrying fragments of destroyed Jewish life into new lands. Children born after the war grew up with the silent presence of trauma in their homes. Emigration was not an end to suffering, but it was a beginning. It gave survivors a chance to live, if not as before, then with the resilience forged in suffering. To these the psychological wounds of the Holocaust extended far beyond liberation. Survivors carried invisible scars, post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, and an enduring fear of persecution. For many, rebuilding trust in humanity was nearly impossible after such betrayal. Therapists and researchers later documented how trauma passed into the next generation, shaping the children of survivors with inherited anxiety and silence. Communities struggled with questions of faith, asking where God had been during the years of destruction. Others clung to faith even more tightly, finding meaning in perseverance. The Holocaust left not only ruins of cities and cemeteries, but also deep fractures in the human spirit. Yet even in trauma, there was resilience, as survivors chose to marry, have children, and teach their stories. This act of living itself became a form of resistance. Their survival was a testament to human endurance against the darkest forces of history. The aftermath of the Holocaust reshaped the world in law, memory, and morality. Nuremberg established precedents that later informed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Survivors became witnesses, their testimonies forming the backbone of remembrance and education for generations. Monuments were built, museums opened, and books published to ensure that the world could never again claim ignorance. The shadow of the Holocaust guided the creation of Israel, which became a refuge for those who had been stateless and persecuted. Yet no political or legal solution could erase the trauma carved into human lives. For survivors, the Holocaust was not history but memory, lived every day in the silence of absence. For the world, it became a warning of what unchecked hatred and indifference could unleash. The trials, the displaced persons camps, and the rebuilding of lives were steps toward recovery, but never full healing. The aftermath of the Holocaust became both a story of justice sought and a reminder of justice forever incomplete. The Holocaust did not end when the camps were liberated. It continues to shape humanity's conscience in every generation. Across Europe and the wider world, memorials rose from the ruins, silent stone reminders of the millions whose lives were extinguished. At Auschwitz, the barracks and barbed wire were preserved, not as relics of horror alone, but as evidence for all who doubted or might one day forget. In Warsaw, a ghetto memorial stood where thousands once starved, a granite symbol of both despair and resistance. Survivors returned to places of atrocity, some unable to speak, others determined to tell their stories until their last breath. Schools, universities, and governments integrated Holocaust education into curriculums, teaching students that silence and indifference are accomplices to evil. Films, books, and testimonies made the Holocaust one of the most documented crimes in human history. Yet memory was never passive. It demanded action from those who inherited its lessons. Never again became both a vow and a question how to ensure history did not repeat. The Holocaust etched itself into the global memory as humanity's darkest warning. The Nuremberg Trials and subsequent legal efforts transformed how the world defined justice after mass atrocity. The term genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin, entered international law, crystallizing the crime of destroying entire peoples. The United Nations adopted the Genocide Convention in 1948, directly shaped by the Holocaust's revelations. Human rights movements found momentum in the ashes of Europe, insisting that sovereignty could not excuse crimes against humanity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed the same year, reflected the lessons of unchecked hatred and persecution. Courts in later decades, from Rwanda to The Hague, invoked the precedents established after World War II. The Holocaust made clear that justice was not only for the victors, but for humanity itself. Yet justice remained fragile, tested by the recurrence of genocides in Cambodia, Bosnia, and Darfur. Each new atrocity asked whether the world had truly learned from 1945. The legacy of the Holocaust lived in both the legal frameworks it created and the haunting failures of global willpower to uphold them. Survivors became the most powerful carriers of memory, their voices piercing through denial and indifference. In classrooms and lecture halls, elderly men and women unrolled the scrolls of their lives, describing cattle cars, ghettos, and camps with unbearable clarity. Their numbers dwindled with each passing decade, but recordings, museums, and archives preserved their testimony for future generations. The Shoah Foundation, established by filmmaker Steven Spielberg, recorded thousands of survivor stories, ensuring that no denial could erase the truth. For those who listened, their words became living bridges to the past, an inheritance of empathy and responsibility. Survivors carried unimaginable grief, yet many dedicated their lives to warning others of where hatred leads. They transformed trauma into testimony, silence into speech, despair into education. In their voices, the Holocaust ceased to be abstract. It became real, personal, and unforgettable. Each account demanded that listeners confront not only history, but their own role in shaping a just society. In this way, memory itself became an act of resistance. Despite overwhelming evidence, Holocaust denial emerged in the post-war years, spreading insidiously across borders. Denial took many forms, minimizing numbers, questioning gas chambers, or framing the Holocaust as Allied propaganda. Often fueled by antisemitism, these narratives sought to erase victims a second time by erasing their suffering. Governments and scholars responded with vigilance, producing archives, testimonies, and criminal laws against denial in some countries. Courts prosecuted prominent deniers, establishing once again that truth is not negotiable. Museums around the world, from Washington, D.C. to Berlin, stood as fortresses against distortion, displaying documents and artifacts beyond dispute. Survivors confronted deniers face to face, wielding memory as their shield. The persistence of denial highlighted the fragility of truth in a world vulnerable to propaganda. Each falsehood reminded humanity of the dangers of forgetting or distorting history. The struggle against denial became as important as the preservation of memory itself. The Holocaust reshaped Jewish identity and global consciousness in profound ways. For Jews, the destruction of 6 million was not only a personal tragedy, but a rupture in cultural and spiritual continuity. Communities in Eastern Europe, once vibrant centers of Jewish life, had been annihilated. Out of the ashes, however, came a renewed determination to survive, to build and to preserve traditions that the Nazis had sought to erase. The creation of the State of Israel in 1948 was inseparably linked to the Holocaust, offering a homeland for survivors and a sanctuary against future persecution. For the wider world, Jewish suffering became a universal parable about the dangers of unchecked hatred. Christian theology underwent self-examination, leading to reforms that condemned centuries of anti-Semitism. Writers, philosophers, and artists grappled with whether the Holocaust represented a break in civilization itself. It became not just Jewish memory, but a human one. In this duality, the Holocaust spoke both to a people and to all peoples. Generations born after the Holocaust inherited not direct trauma, but the responsibility of remembrance. Children and grandchildren of survivors grew up with silences, shadows, and stories that shaped their identities. In many homes, family photographs were missing, relatives unspoken of, and grief woven into everyday life. This inheritance became known as post-memory, the passing down of trauma that survivors themselves could not fully articulate. Literature and film in later decades reflected this second-generation struggle to make sense of the absence. Writers like Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi left a foundation of testimony, but younger voices expanded it into art, fiction, and philosophy. Holocaust education evolved with the times, moving into digital archives and interactive storytelling. Students today can walk virtually through Auschwitz or hear the voices of survivors in holographic interviews. Memory adapted to technology, ensuring relevance in a world ever further from 1945. The Holocaust remained a living story, not confined to the past but carried forward in new forms. WW2. The Holocaust's legacy extended beyond history into the ethics of human responsibility. It asked every generation to consider what they would do in the face of tyranny, silence, or persecution. The story of bystanders, those who did nothing, became as important as the story of perpetrators. It forced societies to confront not only overt hatred, but also the dangers of indifference. From civil rights struggles to refugee crises, activists invoked the Holocaust as a moral compass. Phrases like "never again" became rallying cries, though reality often betrayed the promise. Educators and leaders stressed vigilance, teaching that prejudice rarely begins with mass killing, but with words, stereotypes, and exclusion. The Holocaust taught that the path to genocide is gradual, paved with laws, propaganda, and silence. It urged humanity to recognize warning signs in their earliest stages. In this way, its legacy became not only about mourning the dead, but protecting the living. Doom. Today, more than 75 years after liberation, the Holocaust remains both history and warning. Memorials stand across continents. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, and countless plaques in towns once emptied of Jews. Each is a call to memory, but also to vigilance. Survivors are fewer with each passing year, and soon their voices will exist only in recordings and texts. The responsibility of remembrance now falls on those who never lived through the terror. Denial, distortion, and rising hatred remind us that the lessons of history are fragile. Yet every candle lit on Holocaust Memorial Day, every classroom discussion, and every preserved testimony keeps the vow alive. Never again is not a guarantee but a task, a responsibility handed down to humanity without end. The Holocaust endures as both tragedy and teacher. Its legacy is the moral imperative that memory must be defended, always.